This conference, I think it comes at a very interesting time. As you can see from the title, Taxing Trade and the Implications for Agriculture and Transportation. It's an unusual time, and I suppose partly because we have an unusual person sitting in the White House who is tipping over the apple cart of trade in a way that hasn't been done in, well, 90 years, I guess, since the 1930s, when tariffs were put on so high. And in fact, for almost all of my career, I've seen an effort throughout all the countries, and especially agriculture, trying to bring tariffs down to have freer trade, and we succeeded tremendously. I mean, I think in the case of Western Canada, because we have a very open economy and a very large amount of exports, we've benefited tremendously from the availability of external markets and to be able to do that. At the same time, we've also been able to increase the value of our products, value added, and a lot of our products now which are exported are no longer just raw materials, and we're going to hear more about that today as well. And those markets as well, of course, are subject to tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers, and there is a certain anxiety, I think, amongst the agricultural community as to what the future might hold, and hopefully we'll eliminate some of that, perhaps, or at least soothe a bit of it, or maybe we'll just raise it worse, I'm not sure, but in any case, we'll see what our speakers have to say. It is going to be an interesting day. With that, I will not carry on further. I'd like to invite our first chair, Hedley Auld, to come to the podium and introduce our first speakers. And again, thank you for joining, and we look forward to a very exciting day. Hedley?
Thank you, Barry. Whether you're here in the room or joining us remotely online, a warm welcome to all to this first session of our meeting. The first session theme is Tariffs and Trade. And so I want to thank each of our three presenters for accepting our invitation to offer their perspective on tariffs and trade at this exceptional time of profound uncertainty for all Canadians, whether they are consumers or producers or businesses or governments. So first, some preliminaries. We will ask each of the presenters to allow 15 or 20 minutes for their presentations. We will try to provide each speaker a signal around the 15-minute mark just to give so that they can gauge the progress. But this will allow some time after each speaker for a few questions immediately after their presentations. And then we'll open it up for, you can address questions to all the presenters at the very end of the session. Later, for those in the room, we'll be able to use one of the floor mics here, but those participating remotely, if you wish to pose a question, please type it into the chat room, and I'll monitor your questions, and at the end of the presentations, I'll address them to the speakers. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Trevor Tombe. He is a professor of economics at the University of Calgary and the director of fiscal and economic policy at that university's Graduate School of Public Policy. He's also affiliated with several national think tanks, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Public Policy Forum, and others. His research spans trade, fiscal federalism, public finance, with publications in leading journals and co-authored textbooks. He frequently advises governments and serves on federal policy councils. He's a frequent contributor to national economic debates through op-eds and appearances on online media. If you, like me, have monitored any of these, you'll have seen him on the Hub Canada, Hurly Burly with David Hurley, The Wonk with Amanda Lang, and No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. He hails from BC, I understand, from Pitt Meadows and Maple Ridge. Graduated from Simon Fraser University with double majors in finance and economics. and received his PhD in economics from the University of Toronto. Now, his theme today is food prices, inflation, and trade disruptions, Canada in a world of shocks. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Trevor Tombe. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I think relative to the next two speakers, I do lack some of the in-depth, industry-specific insight and knowledge. And so I think I'm here to set the stage, to give some broader context in the kind of current economic and macroeconomic environment that we're in, and to shed some light on some of the recent challenges that we've faced in Canada in terms of the rise and fall of inflation and the role of food prices specifically in that, and what some of the underlying drivers of the pretty dramatic increase in food prices that we've seen over the past several years. Now, of course, this is within the backdrop of a dramatic change in the U.S. trade policy position, with early April Liberation Day announcements for tariffs against a lot of countries that would have led average tariff rates on U.S. imports to reach about 25%, which exceeds the peak of the average tariff rates that prevailed in the Great Depression. You have to go back to the 1900s to find a moment in the U.S. where average tariffs were as high as what they were announced to be in early April. But while we've seen higher tariff rates in the States before, we have never seen as sharp a change in tariff rates, the year-over-year delta, if you will, in what the average U.S. trade import tariffs would be. It's never increased as much as they would have in early April. And of course, if you recall, that was a pretty interesting month to follow market responses to that announcements. And so the U.S. did change their policy, and today they have in place right now average import tariffs overall of about 18%. Okay, a little below the peak of the Great Depression, but a huge change from the roughly 2% that prevailed this time last year. Now, Canada has been spared a lot of that. Average tariffs on imports from Canada by the United States are, as of July, 2.6%, quite a bit better than the 18 that prevails for U.S. imports on the whole, and only marginally above the 2.2% average import tariffs levied by the states against what Canada sells that prevailed this time last year. So only a marginal change. Now, some sectors, of course, steel and aluminum, autos, softwood lumber, face considerably higher levels of tariffs on their trade with the United States. But on the whole, Canada's economy has been spared what was earlier this year anticipated to be a really difficult trading environment with the U.S. Now, tariffs that the U.S. has levied is just one part of the picture. Canada did retaliate with three broad packages. In early March, a package of 25% tariffs on about $30 billion worth of imports, a considerable amount of which was on food. And then there were later rounds of retaliation as well, expanding the number of goods that those tariffs applied to. And had those tariffs been permanent, they've largely been removed now, so it might be a moot point. I estimate that this would increase consumer prices by quite a bit in a lot of different categories. So furniture, jewelry, clothing would have seen consumer price increases in response to Canada's retaliatory tariffs of about 3%. Food, though, down, if you may or may not be able to see that. If you're online, you can probably see it quite well. Food, I anticipated, would have seen a 1% increase on average in consumer prices, in line with the overall effect for the CPI due to just Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Okay. Now, this 1%, that's a meaningful change, and the overall effect of 1%, you should have in mind that relative to the 2% target that we have for inflation. So a pretty meaningful effect on consumers, but they have been removed as of September 1st, and so the effects will be minimal. But what the biggest challenge is for the Canadian economy and for businesses right across every sector has really been the dramatic increase in uncertainty that everybody is dealing with right now. It's really difficult to plan what your operations are going to be next year, what type of investments you want to make now for the future. Hiring decisions too. How do you make these long-term commitments when the state of play that you'll be operating in is just completely unknowable? Right? We're one tweet away from the fundamental economic relationship being completely upended between Canada and the United States. And we can measure how high uncertainty has been. There's a couple of different measures out there. One that I like that's put together by a team of some leading researchers in the US that's also conveniently publicly available at policyuncertainty.com for about 24 countries. Shows that Canada's measured level of uncertainty, and they infer this from the language we're using to communicate with each other in newspapers and other mediums, it reached a level that's roughly triple what it was at the worst point of the pandemic. Now that feels right, and we're still in a moment of very high uncertainty. It's come down August on par with the worst point in the pandemic. And if you look at consumer sentiment and business sentiment, it's like a mirror image of this. Sharp drop, far worse than even the worst point in the pandemic. And this sharp increase, if historical relationships that have been empirically examined by researchers in these past moments of heightened uncertainty, this scale of increase that we've seen just this year would typically be associated with a roughly 25% drop in business investment and a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment, just from the uncertainty alone. So tariffs aside, by far the largest shock that Canada has been experiencing and many sectors have been experiencing is the uncertainty shock. That's the source of drag right now. But for Canadians, when you ask them to think about their family and the next 2 years, what is going to have a bigger impact on them, 80% do not say, this disrupted trading relationship with the United States. Only 20% of Canadians say that. Abacus found last month, 80% will cite cost of living, housing, and healthcare as much more important to them than the trade disruptions and any impact of trade policies and tariffs on Canada. So I think thinking about food prices and affordability in particular is critically important for governments, right? And therefore for businesses to anticipate how government policies might respond to the current moment. And when we think about cost of living, about 2/3, not quite, but nearly 2/3, really cite food and grocery prices as one of the most important pressures that those families face. 61% saying they do not have confidence in their ability to afford the groceries they want in 6 months. That's not to say they won't be able to afford groceries. They'll just need to change what it is they're purchasing, given whatever their household budget is. And the inflation shock that Canada and many countries have experienced, where we peaked at over 8% in the summer of 2022, we've come down since, thankfully, but that sharp increase in inflation is going to have lasting implications for many years because while inflation has come down, price levels have ratcheted up. And that sharp change, that's the most rapid acceleration in inflation that Canada has seen since the 1950s. And so it's been a really difficult couple of years to adjust to, given how quickly everything is changing. And food and energy costs really play a leading role in rising inflation. What this graph here does is decompose the inflation rate in Canada into its underlying components and highlighting the key drivers of the increase. Vehicles and furniture, which are largely imported in Canada, really did suffer from a lot of the supply chain bottlenecks and challenges that, if you recall, dominated our policy conversation in 2021 and early 2022. And orange is owner-occupied housing, and housing in Canada has its own special set of issues that we don't need to get into. But energy and food alone, those two components explain half of the 8% inflation. Okay. A lot of things going on in energy. I'll circle back to that in a bit. But food, very salient for individuals and driving at peak well over 1 percentage point of the overall inflation, well over 1.5 percentage points of the overall inflation rate. Okay. It's come down since, but it is still a meaningful driver. Right now, the single largest positive component to inflation. Now, why have food prices increased? And I know we'll circle the conversation back to trade disruptions, but I think this context is important. Food prices have ratcheted up by about 30% relative to where they were roughly 5 years ago. Why is the subject of considerable debate and discussions. And when you ask Canadians, they have a number of competing hypotheses. About 1 in 4 Canadians, and this is a survey from Leger last year, would say it is global economic phenomenon, and global inflation, supply chain issues, and so on. A roughly equal number of Canadians would say, no, it is grocery chain profit margins that have driven the increase in food prices. And a roughly equal number would say, no, it's the federal government. That's why food prices have increased. And all other explanations from provincial governments to labor costs and so on, don't even come close. So the 3 dominant explanations are global challenges, grocery price margins, and the federal government. So I just want to quickly, maybe in 5 minutes or so, go through each of these to help frame our thinking about what might be going on. And spoiler, it's going to be the global factors, which means we do need to think about all of the trade disruptions, with this in mind. The global issues have already been the critical driver of food price increases in recent years, and any kind of additional disruption or uncertainty from here just adds to that, which adds to a lot of pressure that's already challenging many Canadians. So the federal government, there's kind of 2 broad ways you could think about what people might mean when they say the federal government is to blame. One is, people point to fiscal expansion during the pandemic, increasing size of the deficit, potentially increasing demand for a lot of goods and services, which increases prices, or low interest rates and expansionary monetary policy doing the same. Or you could think about taxes, and the carbon tax specifically has received a lot of attention when it comes to food prices. So I'll unpack both of those just to give us a sense of whether they might be behind it. So fiscal and monetary policy, how would we look at the data to determine how much of food price increases are due to fiscal and monetary policy? Well, there's a lot of different ways, and I'm sure people will be researching this for many years. So some early work from myself and a colleague at the University of Calgary, Professor Sonia Chen, kind of take some basic Econ 101 intuition to say, well, there's 2 ways that prices can rise. You could experience a demand shock, like an increase in the quantity of a good or service that people want to buy, or a supply shock, an increase in the costs of production or something else that increases price. Notice they differ not in how prices respond. They can both, in principle, increase prices. But if it's a demand shock, quantity rises as well. If it's a supply shock, though, quantity falls. And there's data on this for a lot of different detailed categories in Canada that Statistics Canada puts together, not just in the CPI, but in other data sources that track prices and quantities. And so you can look over time. Are prices increasing while quantities are increasing? Or the reverse, quarter by quarter, adding it up, and then classifying them as demand versus supply. And so we do this throughout the economy to get a sense of inflation overall, but we can zoom in on food prices specifically. And what we find is that of the near 30% increase that we've seen since the start of the pandemic, it's basically a bunch of supply shocks. We've seen food prices rise, but it's not because of a corresponding increase in the quantity that people are demanding, which is what you would expect if it's people receiving transfers from the federal government and spending it on food. Or having low interest rates free up a portion of their budget that would have went to debt service costs and increasing demand for food. We see quite clearly demand shocks are just a tiny contributor of the overall increase. Of course, some is statistically ambiguous, but even if all of that is demand, supply is still the dominant contributor to increases in food prices. So what about taxes? This would be a supply shock. If we're taxing food in a particular way or taxing energy or carbon emissions that cascades through the supply chain, affecting the price of things that we buy. That's a supply shock. Okay, so let's dig into that. So there's a couple of things. Stackhand looks at taxes on items directly, sales taxes, excise taxes, and so on, and reports inflation both with and without. And overall, there's really no difference between the two. Okay, so carbon taxes, just in terms of the direct effect they have on the price of things that we buy, not a meaningful driver of inflation. It has been a meaningful driver more recently with the elimination of the carbon tax, where you can see the red line is the actual inflation being below what it would be had we not canceled the carbon tax, which is in blue, or the GST introducing a similarly interesting gap between the two. But prior to these big changes that we've seen this year, the introduction and gradual increase in the carbon tax hasn't been a driver of inflation. But there's all sorts of indirect effects, right? The carbon tax affecting fuel costs and diesel prices, and therefore trucking costs, which passed through to those who are purchasing those transport services, or the energy that grocery stores are using to heat the space that we're shopping within. All sorts of these supply chain implications. And so there's maybe two ways to think about asking this broader question of, economy-wide, is carbon taxes accounting for an increase in food prices? Well, one really simple thing would be to look at Canada, which does have and did increase the carbon tax, versus a jurisdiction that did not. Kind of a simple comparison. The US does not have a carbon tax, and Canada did. And over time, over the past several years, has kind of basically experienced very similar increases in the food price that consumers faced here and there. Indeed, globally, the World Food Price Index increased by basically the same as what the Canadian Food Price Index has increased by. Now, if we thought the carbon tax had a big effect on food prices, then all else equal, we'd anticipate that the Canadian Food Price Index would have risen by much more. Now, of course, all else is not equal, and so this is not, the end of the story. There might be other things going on offsetting the implications of the carbon tax, but this is kind of an interesting observation. A more detailed look at the whole supply chain implications of carbon pricing was done by myself and another University of Calgary colleague, Jen Winter, that came out just a few months ago in the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics, where we, instead of doing this Canada-US comparison, a more of an empirical approach, we model the whole supply chain and the whole intersectoral linkages and the input-output flows between truck transportation services and food manufacturers and crop and animal production and fertilizer manufacturers and natural gas, everything. The whole Canadian economy and all the interlinkages between them to account for carbon tax cost increases up the supply chain being passed through to other sectors in this cascading way, to try and get a sense of all of those indirect effects, which can matter a lot. Meat product manufacturing, for example. The direct emissions of that sector is only about 0.04 tons per $1,000. Very low emissions in terms of its direct emissions relative to the value of its output. But when you look all up the supply chain, providing all of the inputs, all of them, to the meat product manufacturing, then it adds up to about 1 ton per $1,000 of output. So these supply chain effects matter a lot. Okay. So what we end up finding, and given the time I won't go into all the details, but from farm to tables, if you wanted to Google it, it's open access, so you can get it anywhere. We find that overall, the $80 per ton price would increase food prices by nearly 4%. If all we did was price emissions, no exceptions, no nothing. But there's a couple of details in terms of how we've implemented carbon pricing that are important. First, we don't charge the carbon tax on imports. So if you're a food product manufacturer purchasing inputs from abroad, those inputs are not subject to a carbon price. Now, in principle, you can levy a carbon price at the border. We didn't. And so that shrinks the effect to a little over 3. Because we do, in Canada, in lots of sectors, import a lot of our inputs from abroad. But we also don't charge the carbon tax on all emissions, literally. There's a considerable amount of emissions that are unpriced or exempted from the carbon price. And a lot of agricultural emissions, though not all, are exempt. that shrinks the overall effect a lot to now just over 1%, we estimate. And then the large emitters, from frozen food manufacturers to sugar to cattle slaughtering operations in Alberta. The industrial pricing system is also not just a price on emissions. It's combined with, if you will, for lack of a better word, subsidies on output, which are called output-based allocations, which cushions the effect on their costs. And that shrinks the effect further to 0.8%. So $80 per ton, we estimate, increases the cost of food production by 0.8%. And then as consumers, we import a lot of food directly as well, Florida orange juice and so on, that when accounting for those imports, the overall effect of $80 per ton on consumer prices is 0.5%. Now again, this is not the end of the story either, right? That 0.5% you want to have in mind relative to the nearly 30% increase that we've seen. And so only a small fraction could be attributed to tax policy. Again, there will be other research on this and a lot more details to come. This is just a modeling exercise where we make certain assumptions along the way that other researchers might adapt and adjust and combine with better data as it comes out in the future. But it doesn't look like at the moment taxes are a big part of the story. I'll accelerate a little here. I think I'm bumping up pretty close. No? Oh, okay, great. What about profits? The profit margin increase of grocery stores, that's not just something that in surveys Canadians will point to, but governments have also taken largely performative steps to try and address that challenge, gathering the grocery CEOs most visibly to do some browbeating. But let's look at the data. Profit margins at grocery stores have increased from about 2% prior to the pandemic, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, to about 3.5% on average now after the pandemic. Now, from 2 to 3.5, that's a proportional increase that's fairly large. But you can sort of see this is not going to deliver a 30% increase in prices, just a 1.5 percentage point increase in margins. And I should say that margins might have increased, and I don't have data on this, unfortunately, although if anyone knows someone willing to share detailed product data, I'd be happy to take a look. What might be going on is that people have shifted what they buy from grocery stores. Hey, when you purchase that pre-cooked rotisserie chicken that's really delicious and right there, easy, you just grab it and go, that has a higher margin on it than basic groceries do. And so if consumers are shifting, especially following the pandemic, towards more of the convenience prepared items within a grocery store, grocery profit margins will rise in response, even if prices don't move at all. Because it's just changing the composition of purchases. But put that aside, even if all of this margin increase was because of higher prices, and I don't think that it was, but even if it was, how much of the overall increase in grocery prices would it account for? Only about 1%, one and a bit. The blue line is what grocery prices would have been if profit margins were held fixed this whole time. So yeah, there is a difference between the two lines, and the increase in margins that we've observed might have increased prices, but only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the overall increase. So it's not profits that are behind this. So what's left? Global factors. And we'll be talking a lot about global issues as we go along, trade being very important, shocks elsewhere, propagate internationally through trade. And there's two big shocks that I think matter a lot for food prices. One is energy prices. We went through, starting in 2021 through to the beginning of 2023, the largest and longest energy price shock in many decades. Energy prices rising during 2021 as we came out of the pandemic because demand for a lot of things, energy included, rose and output didn't quite keep pace. Not just oil, natural gas, other energy, and certain other commodities as well. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, spiking those energy price increases further, with oil reaching over $120 a barrel that summer. A very large increase that matters for a lot of goods. And food, it so happens, is one of the most energy-intensive non-energy products. So energy prices will naturally affect costs of production and shipment of food items, therefore prices. But energy cost increases, and natural gas in particular, globally also increased fertilizer prices, which rose a lot through 2021 and increased further following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, reaching globally, depending on the type of fertilizer, roughly triple where fertilizer prices were before the pandemic. So energy price increases and fertilizer price increases were very large global shocks. And I don't have it here, but if you were to look at world consumer food prices, they increased a lot more in 2022 than in Canada. If memory serves, roughly a 60% increase in 2022 relative to where they were pre-pandemic. Now, globally, they came down and now in line with where Canada's increase have been. But globally, these two factors drove food prices very high. Now, in Canada, you see that costs for farmers rose a lot through the early months of 2022, coming down, year-over-year increase of nearly 20%. And that's, of course, going to be passed through. There's a very limited ability for producers to simply absorb that cost increase. And farmers are price takers in the overwhelming majority of cases, of course, but this is a shock that affects all farmers together. And so those market-wide shocks get passed through. And basically, costs increased largely because of two things. The blue bar here is fertilizer. That is by far the largest driver of farm input price increases. And then fuel in black, machinery fuel, the second largest contributor. And most other things, don't add up to too much. These other input costs, they have become more relevant later on, and there's some interesting things to unpack here, but the big shock was really driven by energy and fertilizer. And this is pretty relevant because farm input costs increasing is going to lead to higher prices of the products that are produced, because again, it is this aggregate shock. And typically, historically, farm product prices really strongly predict the grocery prices that we face, with a lag, statistically a 9-month lag. I don't want to hang my hat on 9 months. That kind of a lag is going to vary by crop type and so on. But in aggregate and statistically, it's about a 9-month lag. And so you can see after 2020, this spike here really lines up pretty well with farm product price growth. And about 80% of the variation in consumer prices can be accounted for just by variation in farm product prices. Suggesting that these global factors of energy and fertilizer, that's really the issue for food price increases, and therefore maybe something to think about going forward in terms of how do we better insulate ourselves from these type of shocks? What type of trade policies might help buffer or dampen some of that volatility? And again, this is not the end of the story. People will be studying this moment, the pandemic, the interesting year we've had. People will be studying this for a very long time. And this is just a very simple type of back-of-the-envelope analysis, if you will, to help us think through these issues. But of all the four things, fiscal monetary policy and taxes, right, the federal government doesn't seem to be a meaningful driver of price changes, which is, just to be clear, doesn't mean these policies are good or bad. One can oppose or support carbon pricing for all sorts of reasons. It's just not really a key driver of food price increases. And grocery profit margins, not a meaningful driver of price changes, but maybe we should have a conversation about whether the level of competition is where we want it to be in that sector and others in Canada, and that's fair enough. Okay, but not a big factor here. It's the global factors of energy and fertilizer in particular. So I will conclude, last kind of generic point here, that food prices, and I guess this whole sector, and this is obviously not new, especially in Canada, are subject to these global shocks, especially energy and fertilizer and trade policy changes. And that explains much of what we have gone through and is likely to dominate much of what will be experienced in the years to come. And our exposure is pretty high. A small, open economy naturally and unavoidably is going to be subject to these type of shocks. But there's a lot of options, and I think that'll be a part of our conversation today about how do we build up some resilience in the Canadian economy and agriculture in particular so that we can weather these kind of shocks a little bit better than maybe we have over the past couple of years. So I'll conclude there and pass it back. So thank you very much.
In 1971, just across the way here, I took my first year economics class at St. Paul's College, which is just adjacent to here. And in August 1971, I think it was associated with the U.S. moving off the gold standard, President Nixon tried a stunt with tariffs. I know that you have looked at that in the past, and I wonder if you could maybe put that in a historical context. It wasn't one of the data points that you put on your slide here, but are there any lessons that can come, if not for Canada, then maybe from the United States out of what happened back in 1971?
So that's a great question. The 71 Nixon shock is the most recent parallel to what we're going through right now, although they're completely different when you look at the details. So yeah, the U.S. wanted to move off the gold standard, wanted to address some of the structural imbalances they had in their payment flows across countries, which is much more relevant in a gold standard than it is today with flexible exchange rates. And so part of the adjustment was to have a temporary 10% tariff on all imports, all dutiable imports into the United States across the board. And that affected about 1/3 of Canadian exports to the United States. And so right there, a smaller share than what President Trump had previously commit to tariffing. But also, the objectives of the administration were clear and unambiguous. They needed a revaluation of the fixed exchange rates that different countries had. And their estimate of how much of a revaluation would be needed was about 10%. And so the tariff was not a kind of random result of a fever dream of the president. It was tied to some concrete analysis that suggested the valuation differential was about that 10%. And so they put the surtax on while they were negotiating the revaluation of other currencies that countries were engaged in good faith, and did, after 4 months, again, reach an agreement to revalue some of these exchange rates. France and Germany in particular were two countries of concern at the time, and when those revaluations occurred, the tariff was removed. And so the heightened uncertainty that we're seeing right now was not in play. Now, 10% tariff did matter, and Canadian exports did fall to the United States, but only by about 2%, research has now shown. So a very minimal economic effect. There were some employment implications in Canada as well, but again, very minimal. And I think in part because it was a policy tied to a reasonable objective of the administration with a clear path to a negotiated outcome on legitimate issues. Rather than right now, its tariff policy is so random and unpredictable and used as and sometimes a channel-changing exercise politically in the United States, which makes the path of negotiation really uncertain and unclear. And so the big uncertainty spike makes the current moment completely different.
I have one question from David Kalinchuk online here. Trevor, thank you for your presentation. Currently, mining companies are experiencing increased profits because of low energy costs, oil and gas, and higher commodity prices. Do you anticipate Canadian agricultural producers benefiting from these low energy prices?
So energy is an important input, and it feeds into fertilizer prices as well. And so low input prices combined with high commodity prices, of course, that's unambiguously good. Now, I don't want to predict the future in any way, especially now. So who knows where it goes from here? But yeah, generically speaking, if what you make is now worth more and what you need to buy as an input is worth less, that's a great situation to be in. I think the challenge longer term, these prices are volatile, of course, and managing that volatility is a part of the business in those sectors. But our challenge, I think, will be largely an infrastructure one. To take advantage of higher prices of commodities globally, we need the ability to ship out the commodities and to change where those shipments go. And so the ability to be more flexible in terms of the markets that we sell into and being able to change and respond to volatile pricing environments is not something that we do very well, because of the infrastructure and the port capacity constraints that exist in Canada. So in terms of public policy and allowing us to take better advantage of price changes that become more favorable in the future is to beef up our infrastructure to allow for a lot more optionality than exists right now.
Thank you very much. Well, let's just thank you for that presentation, Trevor. If you could just stand by here.
I do have one question.
Oh, we have one more question. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. It was excellent. I'm curious, it's very clear from your data that uncertainty is driving this, right? And I don't know if this is possible to answer, but it's when it comes down to it, like we seem to be entering this era where public policies and kind of responses are being driven more by vibes than by data. Mm-hmm. How do we reclaim that kind of discourse? And you can see it in like consumer price confidence. You can see it in all sorts of things where people are really sort of making those decisions based on how they feel rather than on anything related to the data. So how do we, and in my opinion, that can only go one way, which is towards more chaos, more uncertainty, right? So how do we re-anchor ourselves in that data, in those so we can begin to look forward and say, so like, and I think the data you had, especially on the carbon tax, was so illustrative, right? Because that was such a feverish discourse around, oh my God, this is causing us to be so uncompetitive, whereas you just showed that it was like a 0.8%, right? So what would you recommend in terms of like bringing us back down to earth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because it gets far beyond economics and much more into psychology and politics and how people form opinions and things like that. I think this year has led to a shift more in the direction of policy that's grounded in reality, in practical considerations with clear objectives in mind, because we've kind of learned that policy matters, and it's kind of a luxury to formulate policy based on vibes, and maybe a luxury that maybe we had before, but we certainly don't now in a world where for a small, open, and trade-intensive economy subject to all of these uncertainties, we clearly can't control a lot of what happens certainly south of the border or elsewhere, but we can control what happens in Canada. And provincial and federal governments have now been, this year, really motivated to prioritize economic outcomes, move quickly on policy that is practically, grounded in good data, good analysis, and we'll see what the follow-through's like. But the big moves on internal trade, the big commitments to ease regulatory barriers federally, to move forward on major projects, I think this is really encouraging. And if it continues, then I think we'll be moving more in that direction. So it's really not what I think we should do to move policy in that direction, but what can we as voters do to, I guess, give credit to governments that take policy decisions that are aiming at the right things? Well, a lot of the decisions are going to fail. And maybe some of these national projects will turn out to have, in hindsight, maybe gone way over budget or not actually achieved the outcomes that they were hoped for. And we as voters should give governments some rope. Like when they take policy decisions, if it doesn't work out, that's great, move on to something else. And that kind of willingness to allow for policy failure, I think also creates an incentive structure for governments not to just base things entirely on the comms strategy side of things.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor just before we turn things over? Trevor is going to stay here with us, and so perhaps at the conclusion of the panel we'll bring you back up here. But I think in one answer to that question is to have more of Trevor's research brought to the general public. This is a fascinating decomposition of the inflation phenomenon in the food sector, which was really eye-opening, I think, for many of us. So thank you, Trevor. Thank you. Our next speaker is Brittany Wood. She is the Senior Manager of Transportation and Trade Policy with the Canadian Canola Growers Association, a producer association here based in Winnipeg. Brittany joined CCGA in the spring of 2024, and she's been working to advocate for canola farmers' interests in the areas of international trade and biofuels, transportation policy, and innovation. Before she joined CCGA, Brittany was involved in the canola industry with the Canola Council of Canada, also here in Winnipeg, and worked on market development and diversification and the promotion of canola oil and canola meal markets. She's a native Manitoban. Brittany earned her bachelor's degree in animal science here at the University of Manitoba, and then a master's degree in ag sciences from the University of Alberta, focusing on dairy cattle nutrition. So your theme today is Canada's resiliency in turbulent trade times. So please welcome Brittany Wood.
Thanks very much for having me today. This is my first Fields on Wheels conference, so looking forward to the whole day. Looks like a really good agenda, and thank you very much for having me. There's just a couple things going on in canola these days. We tend to be a bit of a busy crop. There's always lots to follow and lots to report on. So I will, I'm going to try and keep the presentation today as upbeat as I can, because, you know, we're going through some hard times and I'm not going to gloss over them. But I am going to keep us optimistic, because I do think there most certainly is optimism in the industry. So we'll end there. Now, just to introduce you to CCGA, the Canadian Canola Growers Association. We are the national farmer advocacy organization. We have members of our provincial canola growers across the country, across the prairies, BC through to Ontario. CCGA works on the Advanced Payment Program, and we work on policy issues that are impactful to the approximate 40,000 canola farmers in Canada. Okay, I'm going to structure us in kind of three buckets here. We're going to talk about the importance of trade to canola, okay? And so that is, without question, trade extremely important to the canola sector. We export about 90% of everything that we produce here in Canada in terms of seed, oil, and meal combined. And so trade, top priority. I'm going to dig into our top markets a little bit. I'm going to talk about China. I'm going to talk about the United States. We're going to dig into the challenges and also, believe it or not, some opportunity. And then I'm going to end us here on growth and where the market or where the industry is going, what kind of opportunities we have. And so I'm going to end us here on biofuels. So prepare yourself for some biofuel talk. Okay. Canola has some real concentrated markets. And so what you have in front of you here, these are the top markets that canola products were exported to in 2024. This is the value. And what stands out? I think it's pretty obvious, right? You've got the United States as our #1 market. You have China, #2. Then countries like Japan, Mexico, European Union. Depending on the year, you might see the UAE up there as well. If you were to extend that out to, say, the top 8 or the top 10, you'd get maybe Pakistan, South Korea, Bangladesh. A few other countries kind of come in on that tail, but it is very much heavy here on the left-hand side. And so if you break it out by products, we export seed. We also crush seed here in Canada, and we export canola oil and canola meal. So if you look at seed, it's the blue color. You'll see China being the predominant buyer of Canadian canola seed, but it is a little bit more diversified in terms of our products. You see Japan in there, you see Mexico, EU. As I said here, you'd also see Pakistan and UAE, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of oil, the oil is primarily going to the United States, and I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. There are, so you see the yellow there on Japan, on Mexico. Those are very small volumes. Apologies. And canola meal. Canola meal goes to the United States and China, and has for some time. I'm going to break it down for us. We're going to just kind of dive in here to some details on seed, oil, and meal. So this is seed. Apologies, we're going to crop year. We were on calendar year. I'm flipping us to crop year here. So you can see here, this goes back about 5 years. We've got a drought year. We also have some additional challenges with our trade to China mixed in here. So there's some story along the way. But you do see that significant seed export to China. You do see volumes that are typically a little bit more consistent for Japan and Mexico. We like to see them a little bit higher, but you see them up there as well, just below that kind of 2 million ton mark and 1 million ton mark. And the other countries, as I mentioned. All right. Now, canola oil exports are going to the United States, have for a long time. There are other markets of importance here, but there is a bit of a story here also. So you see, like if you were to take this back even another 5 years, you would see our exports of oil to the United States have been pretty stable. They're, below that 2 million ton mark. And then you see this huge takeoff, 2022 to 2023, and then even again. And then, oh no, we've come back down. So the story there is really that in December 2022, canola oil was approved for use in renewable fuel production in the United States. The next month, oil exports to the United States picked up significantly, and all the way through that year and the next, okay? I just want to draw attention to this because we don't see this kind of significant new market growth ever for canola oil. Like this is big, right? So we see this big new market opportunity. Unfortunately, we've kind of come back down the other side a little bit. But as I mentioned, there are some opportunities here to get us back on the upward trajectory. So some policy changes around biofuels happened January 2025. And those changes have impacted canola's competitiveness or place within the biofuel market within the United States. A whole lot has happened on biofuel policy since January. And I'm going to dig into it a little bit more for us, but we do think that there are now some positive signals that could bring us back up into, a little bit more of that upward slope. Okay, but other markets are important, all right? So the United States, of course, our number one market. China's important for canola oil. China definitely is, and of course we are shut out of China right now. But you see back to 2020, 2021, China has the ability to take canola oil, Mexico, small amounts, South Korea, small amounts, Chile. There's other markets there as well, but they are small in market size. And then canola meal goes to the United States and goes to China. We will see some diversity here in canola meal markets as the crop year this new crop year continues on in the calendar year. We are not in a position right now to be exporting much of any canola meal to China, and we do see a few other markets coming online. But the challenge is the size, right? So the United Kingdom, Vietnam, Mexico, they're not taking, the volumes that China is able to take, or collectively, I should say. Okay, so I mentioned that United States is important to us. $7.7 billion in our export value to China in 2024. That's out of, I believe, $14.4 billion. That is a significant amount. So we focus a lot of our efforts in this marketplace. We are looking very closely at the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement Review, or CUSMA Review, or USMCA, whatever you prefer to call it. We are engaged in those consultation processes and the review that comes up in July 2026. Canadian products exported tariff-free to the United States. Extremely important that we see that continue on with this review process. We also have products that come into Canada that are important for Canadian farmers as well. Machinery, we've talked even about, Trevor talked about some of that earlier. So those products are important that we see that, we don't have additional duties, for example, or restrictions to those purchases that farmers need to make in order to keep their input costs as low as possible, in order to maintain profitability. Biofuel policy. So if you follow any of the news on biofuel policy in the United States, you'd have heard terms like 45Z, producer's tax credit, renewable volume obligations. There's a whole slew of terms. There's a whole bunch of different policy changes that have happened here. Language that was published in the One Big Beautiful Bill, or passed through in the One Big Beautiful Bill, has actually now put canola into a position where it can earn credits under the producer's tax credit. So a renewable fuel producer can now use canola oil or a feedstock from North America. We've also seen some positive changes to the modeling there that are again beneficial to canola and how it is calculated into its score and the credit that it generates for those fuel producers. So that is good news. However, there's another challenge, but also an opportunity. So I talked about the EPA has published the renewable volume obligations for renewable fuel in the United States. Those numbers are high, and actually higher than perhaps the industry was anticipating they would be. So those volumes trigger a real strong demand signal for vegetable oils in the United States for 2026 and for 2027. Now, there is kind of a currency linked to that RVO, that right now we are hopeful to see some better language for canola, for Canadian feedstock. And so we're working on that angle, and also at the same time, we see that pie is growing, okay? So we do see a positive outcome there. Taking us into China. So we've had quite a year in terms of tariffs on canola products to China, unfortunately. And you remember, it's our number 2 market and number 1 market for canola seed exports. So in September, just over a year ago, we had China's MOFCOM announced the anti-dumping case into Canadian canola seed. And CCGA is a registered party in that investigation in order to be there to advocate for Canadian farmer interests. August 12th, just as everyone, including myself, was perhaps coming back from some summer vacation, we've got preliminary duties on canola seed. So now we see duties of 75.8%, which are prohibitive to trade. Those are now in place, and so we won't have China in the market here, until that is resolved. We're waiting on final duties as well, and so that the whole case has been extended for another 6 months through to March 2026. So between now and March, we will hopefully see this resolved, or we will see preliminary or final duties. In the meantime, March 9th, 2025, China announced the conclusion of the anti-discriminatory investigation that it had launched as a result of Canada placing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles back in summer of 2024. And the result is 100% tariffs on canola oil, canola meal, and other agricultural products that I'm sure we'll talk more about. So the canola industry, CCGA, and our other national partners, we are very much engaged with government and advocating for this trade challenge to be resolved. We need to see this market reopened. We need to see market access regained, and we are, encouraged to see government engaging with China, and hope that this is resolved very, very quickly. Okay, quickly, I'm going to touch on what is happening on canola movement, because I know there's a bit of a focus here on transportation. I wanted to just briefly mention this, and thank you to Mark and his team for the image you see up here. I was having a look at some of the early data on exports of canola or unloads of canola out at Vancouver, looking at farmer deliveries, that sort of data. I think what my message is for you at the moment is that there's still so much of this story to unfold. But if you look at the blue here, this is kind of our current situation, August data. You see the, I guess that would be a red or orange dotted line at the top. Right here, this is last year. So last year was quite an anomaly. We had a really heavy export program kind of very early on into the season. And so you see us pretty in line with perhaps where we've been in previous years. And of course, lots to come on this. But some of the things that I think are important to note, we have a big crop, right? We see Stats Canada's estimated 20 million tons. You've seen perhaps other reports of higher numbers. So big crop. Smaller carry-in or tighter carry-in this year. So we didn't have the seed to export in August like perhaps we did last year. Farmers are really wrapping up harvest. They're really just wrapping up harvest. So it wasn't an early harvest by any stretch. Prices are what they are, right? They're not necessarily, really urging farmers to sell canola right now. So if you, depending on your farm situation, you might be storing your canola or you might be selling it. But we do see that, or I think we anticipate here, a lot of this story is yet to unfold. And of course, China's not in the market. Okay, so now I'm going to get us to what is the kind of more positive outlook for canola. And now that you've seen, we've got these two real strong markets, but what is canola thinking on terms of market diversification? This is an important one. We hear this all the time. I think that the canola industry has been working on market diversification for some time now. And what we've been doing is working on canola's position or canola's place in a domestic biofuel market. Canola oil from Canada, it's poised to contribute to that growing demand. Like I talked about, the United States is growing. Canada is also growing its demand for biofuels, and we need that high quality feedstock. Now, market diversification is a long-term game. There's no quick fix that is a high value. So we've been, I think the industry, the canola industry, the biofuel industry have really been kind of working at this for some time. Huge investments have been made, and we are starting to see those come to fruition or start to come into the marketplace. So we have a renewable fuel facility in Strathcona now that is started to be up and running. That is a significant market driver for demand. And I'll give you a kind of a more literal example of that right away here. But that demand requires oil. And so we've increased our crush capacity significantly in Canada already. And there's more to come. So if we see, previous years, we might have been around 11 million tons of crush capacity in Canada. Now we're up. We are projected to be 15 million tons by the end of 2026. So that puts us in a very different position than perhaps we were 5 years ago. That means, if the crop is 20 million tons, there could be potential to process a significant amount more here in Canada, making it so that we have less reliance on our seed export markets as well. Okay, so to give you, actually, I'm going to just finish one thought on biofuels here in Canada, and that is that, like I talked about in the United States, it's a policy-driven market, a regulated market, and that's the same here in Canada. And so as CCGA, as canola organizations, we are very much working with government on that regulation to make it so that Canadian farmers have that access to it and that it works for them, works to our advantage. Okay, so materially, what does a domestic biofuel market mean for canola demand? So I mentioned the facility in Strathcona. So if you take on the right-hand side there, if that facility produces 1 billion liters of renewable fuel, it requires 1 million metric tons of canola oil. And that could be several crush plants just to service that one plant, that one RD plant. If you back that up to a seed equivalent, it's about 2.5 million metric tons of seed. Now, that is like a whole new market. That's a big, big new market, actually. So if we look at our second and third top markets for seed exports in 2024, that's Japan, that's Mexico, that's both of them combined, right? So this is a whole new market that we have here in Canada. New market demand does good things for prices, good things for farmers. It's also driving some economic growth in terms of the communities that are supporting that those additional facilities, and less reliance eventually on our export markets, as I said. So this is why we make a big deal of it, and why we talk about it. Whenever we talk about canola, markets and trade, we talk about this. Again, just another metric that I follow or that we've been looking at is how much canola stays here at home. How much canola oil are we using here at home, right? So we see this new industry, and what does it mean in terms of the numbers for canola oil? So as I mentioned, the biofuel market in Canada, it's just getting its feet, it's just getting going. But we already see some significant increase in the amount of canola oil that's staying here in Canada each year. And so if you look, 4 years back to now, that's just shy of 500,000 tons of oil. Like I said before, that kind of market doesn't just come around every day. That is a big deal for us. And again, why we're keeping this one top of the priority list. Okay, so in conclusion, I think 2 main points. As I've talked about for the last 5 minutes, canola and biofuels, very high priority for us in terms of our market diversification and our opportunity for growth. And then the final point is that we need to see trade challenges, market access, commitments to rules-based trade. Those are very high priority topics for farmers. We need to see our China market reopened and the commitment to our trade with the United States through our CUSMA agreement as well. So I think that's where I'll end, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Brittany. First of all, let me ask if there are any questions from the floor right now. I have one question. I shared some statistics with you last night when we first met, and we've been through this once before with China, and although the impact on the canola oil export market is new, I guess. What are you seeing so far this year in terms of the diversification of overseas export markets for canola oil, Canadian canola oil? Can you give us the audience a brief breakdown?
Yeah, there are a few markets that we are seeing smaller volumes of export to. I think probably the most noticeable is South Korea. So South Korea is a market that has kind of been in the game for canola exports for many years. It wasn't, just recently we've seen it drop off in a couple of years when we probably saw more pull into the United States. But South Korea has been a long-term, consistent buyer of canola oil. It's a small volume. So I think, if I'm just recalling from my memory kind of when we would have seen a little bit more stable imports into South Korea, like maybe around 120,000 tons, something like that. So important, and then you got to put it on the scale of kind of that strength of the United States market or other markets. Mexico is another one that can take some canola oil, maybe around 100,000 tons in a year. I'm not quite sure what it has looked like here over the last couple of months on numbers, but I know it's definitely in the market. Malaysia might take some small volumes, and there's a few other countries that'll take some small volumes, right? But they are, I think what's important is that that we look at it on the scale of, it's 3 million tons, for example, to the United States. I'm kind of pulling some rough numbers here, but it's 50,000 tons perhaps to Mexico. So they are important in the grand scheme and an additive. And maybe also a note on diversification. We don't think about it so much as moving away from a country or from a use. We think about it in terms of additives. So market diversification is often about how do we find new uses and additional markets, because we overall want to see this industry grow. And even though we're challenged right now with tariffs, I think we look at that diversification from a how can we see new uses, food, feed, and fuel for canola.
Yes, thank you. Aaron Dolinick with the Manitoba Trucking Association. How price competitive do you think renewable diesel is, and do you see that factoring into future demand?
Like a kind of a long-term outlook for renewable diesel? I mean, it's definitely in Canada, it's a regulated market. So there are obligated parties, the fuel producers need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that supports those industries. So we don't, see Canada moving away from that, perhaps. So we do see that market. But we do want to see that be a long-term signal, right? You need that kind of long-term signal in order to have that certainty, or right now lack of uncertainty per se, in investments and growth. And the United States also very much policies, rules that support that industry as well. And you see big investment into those facilities. And you see, I mentioned the RVOs, the renewable volume obligations going out. We have numbers to 2027. But yeah, I think it's the policies that support them that are important. And that's why we're interested in those policies.
One from online here from Dave Kalenchik. Can you comment on canola biofuel performance in cold weather climates?
That's a great question. I think what we know here is that biodiesel, renewable diesel, we don't see any challenges for that inclusion in our cold climates now. I'm not going to give you the specifics on the science on that one, but I think we've come to a place now where we know that efficiency and use is there.
Rajbir Bhatti is asking, as we look to diversify export markets, how critical are logistics and inland port infrastructure in connecting prairie farmers to non-Chinese buyers efficiently?
Yeah. I think, as I mentioned, canola is moving all the time. It moves long distances either to Vancouver, but I think the question is more inland. We, very much need to see that efficient movement of product. There's challenges, of course, with weather, and we do have a large crop, but I think we really need to see that efficient movement. In terms of perhaps inland infrastructure, I don't know that I have a comment on that. We definitely are supportive of infrastructure at our ports, at our export ports, and increasing those efficiencies of movement wherever we can.
Another question from Chris Ferris. Are changes in U.S. biodiesel policy anticipated to divert substantial soybean oil or meal into Canada?
I think we'll see soybean oil in the United States be used because those RVO volumes are high. And so the demand for soybean oil into the United States for that market specifically is strong. Very strong. So I think we'll see, we see a strong pull within the United States for that soybean oil for sure. Soybean meal coming into Canada. Soybean meal does come into Canada already. That is we do have those imports. We have canola meal here in Canada, which is an excellent protein ingredient for livestock. I could go on and on. So we'll see. We'll see. Both are excellent feed ingredients. So, yeah, but there's lots of it.
We talk a lot about the oil, but the byproduct is the meal. If we're producing all this additional oil, what happened to the market for the meal? Is it holding up as well?
Yes. Good question as well. So yes, and the canola crop, I mean, canola seed is about half or just over half of that volume in that seed is meal. And soybean meal is soybean has much greater content of soybean meal. So yes, market, I know the industry and CCGA doesn't work on this directly, but market development, market research, work on canola meal, very much a priority for some of our other industry members. The Canola Council works on that. It's a live challenge for sure.
Thank you, Brittany. Let's stop there. There are a few other questions, but maybe we'll have a chance for us to address those at the end of the session here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So our final speaker on this panel is Cam Dahl. Cam is currently the general manager of the Manitoba Pork Council, based in Winnipeg. He has extensive experience in leadership roles with producer-led organizations, including service as the founding president of Cereals Canada, as a commissioner for the Canadian Grain Commission, and as general manager of the Manitoba Beef Producers. His experience includes advocacy work on Parliament Hill and service on ag industry boards. He was chair of the board of the Canada Grains Council and chair of the steering committee of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. As a volunteer, he's been a director and chair of the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame and a director of Farmers Abroad Canada, a charity focused on education and development in West Africa. Cam and I first met about 30 years ago. He had the unenviable task of monitoring the Western Grain Transportation System as a staff member at the GTA, the Grain Transportation Agency, the Western Grain Transportation Office of Transport Canada, and the Car Allocation Policy Group, all of these wonderful acronyms. The theme of Cam's presentation today is trade, tariffs, and protectionism. Cam.
Thank you, Henley. There's a few people in this room that maybe we should sit down together and write a history book. Thank you, Barry, for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here today. Before I get into talking about tariffs and trade and protectionism, I do want to introduce, and I use that word because I think I don't think the pork industry's impact in Western Canada, and in particular in Manitoba, is all that well understood. So just a little bit about the sector. We produce about 8 to 8.5 million pigs every year. That's the most in Canada. Like canola, 90% of this production is exported, either as pork products around the world or as live animals into the United States. And Japan and the United States are our two largest markets. Just to give you some impact, 22,000 jobs in Manitoba depend upon the pork sector. It contributes $2.3 billion in GDP into the province every year. And to put that into context, that's 72 new schools every year. That's 11 highway interchanges every year. And 16 ER hospitals. So it's a major driver of Manitoba's economy. Also contributes about $200 million every year in municipal, provincial, and federal taxes. So a really critical piece of Manitoba's economy. Manitoba hog farmers purchase 2 million tons of feed every year. Locally, that's worth about $500 million. And that's kind of trade diversification in action because that is feed and products that don't have to be exported. And yes, canola meal is one of those. Soybean meal is an important ingredient as well. And the hog sector is responsible for 50% of all the agriculture and food manufacturing jobs in Manitoba. And just to touch a little bit more on food manufacturing and processing, because this is sometimes forgotten, especially when we talk about trade, and I'm going to talk a little bit about trade and trade-offs. Food manufacturing and processing is the largest manufacturing industry in Canada by a large margin. 20% of total manufacturing sales in Canada come from food. And we forget that. Policymakers forget that way too often and focus on other parts of the economy, and sometimes food and agriculture gets traded off. Meat products comprise the largest portion of the food manufacturing sector in Canada. And again, just to put this into context, meat product manufacturing is the most important food industry in Quebec, in Ontario, in Manitoba, in Alberta, and in British Columbia. So a critical component of the economy across the country, and also heavily trade dependent. So just to talk a little bit about the topic today, trade and protectionism, and kind of the new world order that we're living in. We are witnessing a growth in protectionism around the world, and the two flags on the screen are there on purpose. But I think it's important to recognize that while November 4th, 2024 was a very disruptive day for international trade and for agriculture trade, protectionism didn't begin there. This was something that was happening long in advance of the US election, and it's not party specific in the US. And let me give you a couple of examples. One is country of origin labeling. People may remember that from the early 2000s. It's something that Canada and Mexico took the United States to the World Trade Organization and won because of their origin labeling. Well, country of origin labeling is back. And this is something that was introduced by the Democrats. And as of July 1st, the product of US label will only be used where an animal was born, raised, processed, and packaged in the US. And what does that mean? Well, that is something that will significantly interrupt the integrated North American market, because now we see cases where, for example, an animal will be born in Canada. It will be finished and processed in Iowa. The hams will go into Mexico for further processing and smoking, packaged in Mexico, and shipped back into Canada and the United States for retail sale. That is an efficient integrated system. And this is going to break that down. It's also going to have a further impact because the largest purchaser of food in the United States is actually the government of the United States. And the government of the United States is going to buy product of the USA. So this is a significant interruption of our integrated market. And yes, it happened before November 4th, 2024. Another is California's Proposition 12. What California has said is that they're going to impose animal welfare conditions that are not science-based, by the way, on all red meat products and chicken and eggs that are sold in California. What that means is they are taking their regulations in California and they are extending them throughout North America in particular. So farmers in Manitoba are now having to comply with California regulations. And there are other states that are looking to do similar things, but slightly different. So suddenly we have a fragmented United States where producers are going to need to look at producing for specific states and specific markets. Again, this is going to increase cost. This is going to increase segregation. It's arbitrary. And frankly, we didn't negotiate a trade agreement with individual states. We organized it, or we negotiated it with the United States of America. So this is something, this extrajudicial reach of subnational governments is something that does need to be addressed. And then, of course, we do have the tariff threat. And I want to emphasize or support something Professor Toom said, is, live pigs and pork exports are currently covered under the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, so they're entering the US tariff-free. There is significant uncertainty into the future. And what has been the greatest impact? That has impacted investment throughout the entire value chain. And we are in a period of the production cycle where we should be seeing investment. Where we should be seeing investment on farm and Agriculture has become expensive, so a new hog barn is not $10,000; it's $15 million to $20 million. We should be seeing investment in additional processing, but that investment is not happening. And the significant reason that is not happening is because of global and trade uncertainty, in particular with the United States. Which brings us to the review, renegotiation of the Canada-US trade agreement. This is critical for us, and I'll mention this later on, and I think this is supported by Brittany's presentation. We can look for market diversification, we can look for new trade markets, we can look for new uses, but we are not going to replace the United States. They will still be our neighbor. So we need to really pay attention as an agriculture sector to the renegotiation and to the consultations that have already begun. They've begun in Canada, they've begun in the United States, and they've begun in Mexico. We need to be engaged as an industry in giving good policy advice to our governments and to our negotiators, and that includes both provincial governments as well as the federal government. So the first goal is the preservation of what we've got. The integrated North American market is critically important to agriculture producers across this country. It's even more important to agriculture producers in Western Canada. The US is a critically important market. Mexico is a critically important market. We need to preserve what we have. We also need to change the narrative a little bit. We don't need to just talk about trade being good for all of us, because that narrative really isn't going over very well with the administration. We need to talk about other things. We need to talk about North American food security. We need to talk about North American national security, as it were, and how the integration of Canada and the United States and Mexico contributes to the United States security, national security and food security, as well as some of those pesky things like food inflation. And that if the United States is going to address those issues, then Canada needs to be a key partner, and Canada's food and agriculture and food manufacturing sector needs to be a key part of that negotiation. So we need to change the narrative a little bit away from just finances and economics and talk a little bit more about some of the other security issues. Again, I mentioned trade protection isn't just about the United States. It's been growing around the world. We don't have a 78% tariff on China, thankfully, but Canadian pork exports are facing a 25% tariff on product moving into China. And China is a key market. It isn't a uniform product that we ship around the world. There are many products that come off of an animal. And other countries don't really buy what China buys. And so there isn't a ready replacement for China. We can't take a container that's destined for China and say, oh, well, we'll ship it to Mexico, because the Mexicans don't want it. And so the cost of that tariff is being absorbed by Canadian processors, and ultimately it's being absorbed by Canadian producers. And this is where, one of the reasons why I included some of those comments about the importance and size of Canada's food manufacturing sector is because there is a real sentiment, especially here, especially in Western Canada. I think it also probably applies to a lot of canola farmers, that our economic interests have been traded off to protect other sectors and have been traded off to protect other parts of the economy. So as governments look at the trading environment and look at the CUSMA review, it's critically important that I'll use the word vibe, because it's not something that is necessarily borne out in statistics. But this is something that definitely needs to be addressed. And then I want to just touch on something else, because again, this gets into some of those concepts about diversifying our markets and looking for other places to sell stuff. Well, some of those other places that we want to sell stuff haven't been really very cooperative about buying our stuff. And the Canada EU Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement was signed in 2016. Almost all of agriculture supported that agreement, especially export-oriented agriculture. 90% of farmers depend upon the export market, our international markets, for price determination and for market access. There has almost been no benefit to Canadian agriculture from that agreement. The reason is non-tariff trade barriers. So while the tariff barriers might have come down, Europe has put other barriers in place, whether it's around technology on seed, whether it's around food safety on red meat products. We're essentially not exporting any more food and agriculture products to Europe than we did when that agreement was signed. And that's something that needs to change. And that's something that our governments need to address when they take up that challenge of trade diversity. There are opportunities, but there are political and regulatory reasons why those opportunities have not been realized. So we're seeing, the tariff threat. We're seeing protectionism in some of our largest markets. What should we be doing about it? I think in particular, I'd like to focus on the renewal or review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. The first thing is we really need to have a plan as agriculture, and we don't. Do you know there are over 400 agriculture organizations in Canada? And so if you're a trade negotiator or you're the federal minister of agriculture and you have 400 different opinions on your desk, you can do whatever you want, or you can do nothing. You haven't been provided good advice. You haven't been provided strategic advice. So agriculture needs to get together and have a strategic plan. And we probably should have done that 2 years ago, 18 months ago. The consultations have started in all 3 countries. We need to do that today. We must be more prepared going into the review of CUSMA, and we must be more prepared in looking for example, in opportunities with our TPP partners. We must be more strategic in breaking down some of those barriers in Europe. Number 2, we need to be reaching out to our partners in the United States. And that doesn't mean going to Washington. Going to Washington is okay. We need to be reaching out to our individual states. Senators aren't going to listen to a Canadian agriculture organization. They're probably not going to listen to the government of Canada. But the 2 senators from Iowa are going to listen when the president of the Iowa Farm Bureau calls. So we need to be talking to the president of the Iowa Farm Bureau. And they're our allies. They understand the value of trade. They understand the value of the integrated market. And that outreach is critically important. And can say from experience, I'm not using Iowa as an example randomly. They buy 2 million pigs every year from Manitoba, so they're an important market. And we spent considerable time in Iowa, talking to state representatives, talking to state senators, talking to the government, the lieutenant governor, the agriculture secretary, talking to farm leaders. And they're our allies. And we need to build more of those relationships across the United States. And that gets back to part of that strategic plan for Canadian agriculture. It's important for governments to do that, but it's just as important for agriculture as a whole to carry out that outreach. And we also do need to see interprovincial collaboration. There are only so many resources. I'll take the prairies, for example. We do have a lot of common agriculture interests with Alberta and Saskatchewan. We should be working together We should be developing, okay, here's a map of the United States. These are the areas that are most critically important for Saskatchewan. These are the areas that are most critically important for Manitoba. Let's have a common approach and a common message. We will be far more successful that way. The fourth thing we need to do is we need to challenge. Canada has more trade agreements than any other country in the world. We are connected to Europe, we are connected to North America, we are connected to South America, we are connected to Asia. But we don't do a good job of ensuring those agreements are enforced. So when Europe puts up trade barriers, we need to challenge that. We need to use the tools. I know the WTO isn't 100% functional. That's a slight understatement at the moment. But we need to use the tools that are available under CETA. We need to use the tools that are available under CUSMA to challenge things like Proposition 12 in California, to challenge the non-tariff trade barriers in Europe. This needs to be part of the government agenda. I want to know, Minister Carney has spent a lot of time in Europe in the last few months. That's a good thing. But I don't know if agriculture was on his agenda. And it should be, because again, agriculture, manufacturing, food manufacturing is the largest manufacturing sector in Canada. So when the largest manufacturing sector in Canada has been shut out of a trade agreement, that is something that the government of Canada needs to address. And the fifth point, and this is the final point I'd like to make, and what should we do about protectionism, including the growing protectionism in the United States, is we do need to diversify. But back to the earlier point, we do need to recognize that we're not going to replace the United States. They are our most important partner, and we do need to spend some time with them. There are opportunities in Asia with our CPTPP partners, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Canada is 100% to blame for that name, by the way. There are opportunities there, but we need to explore them, and we need to explore some of those non-tariff reasons why they're not happening, and why the United States, frankly, is getting ahead of us in some of these markets, like Vietnam. The upcoming budget will include austerity measures. We should not be eliminating market development, but I would suggest to policymakers that we should be focusing on new markets and not necessarily the places where we've gone for the last 30 years. And my final point, again, is that true diversification will require overcoming some of those non-tariff trade barriers that we see in some markets. So Hedley, those are my remarks, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cam. Here's an unanswerable one from Brenda Whitson. How would you recommend that 400 agricultural associations work together?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Yeah, completely unanswerable.
Yeah. No, it's a struggle for an industry that is highly diverse and to bring matters.
I think I would make a point. So I've worked in different sectors of export agriculture, and I think there can and should be a broader recognition that at the high level, our interests are very similar. We're market access, international market access, critically important. Rules-based trade, critically important. Science-based regulations, critically important. Things like access to labor. These are common issues across all of export agriculture. So I think sometimes we get focused on the details and forget that we actually have a lot in common.
A question here from, Peter, can I provide you with the microphone?
Yeah, very, very interesting talk that you had there. I was wondering, in terms of the new markets, where are the new markets? And we always hear, well, I shouldn't say we always, but more recently we've heard about growing market demand in many African countries because of higher population growth compared to other countries, and also some of the areas in Africa growing faster, plus free trade integration. Just wondering if that's an area of growth.
It's a possibility. I think for the sector I work in, Asia is more interesting, and I'll take a country like Vietnam, for example, that is seeing significant rise in income. They're significant pork eaters. They're seeing growth in protein consumption. And at the same time, disease issues have upset their local production. They're TPP partners. We should be spending a lot of time in Vietnam is an example. Philippines is an example. Canada and Manitoba in particular has a very close relationship with the Philippines. That is a potential growth market. So at the top of my list would be, actually realizing some of the benefits of CETA is high on the diversification list, and then our TPP and ASEAN partners.
I am Derek Bruin with Agribusiness at the University. Just one thing, the consultations are starting on the CUSMA review, and my experience is when academics get involved, usually they do the opposite of what we ask them to do. I won't participate, but I wanted to just flag what the process is so anybody who's listening, how they could get involved with that consultation. And another question I have, during the COVID events, it looked to me like the value chain roundtables worked pretty well, and I'm wondering what you think about them as a leadership group and setting up our strategies.
I think there is some opportunities, especially in the in relation to the upcoming review of CUSMA. Just to your first part of the question, the consultations end on November 3rd in Canada, so we need to get our comments. And back to the other comment, if we have 400 different opinions going in about what agriculture needs, we're not going to make the memorandum to cabinet. And so there needs to be significant unity and significant strategy involved in what agriculture puts forward. But in the previous trade negotiations, there was something called the Sectorial Advisory Group on International Trade. And SAGIT was a group of trade experts from industry that all signed confidentiality agreements. And as things were happening in the negotiations, negotiators and governments could go to this, very knowledgeable, precise group and say, hey, you can't talk about this right now, but here are the issues that are on the table today. What advice do you have for us, both as government as negotiators? SAGIT was, for a number of reasons, was disbanded. I think we need to revisit some of those very active advisory bodies that were in place in the past.
What about the value chain?
I don't think they're working now, to be blunt about it.
Okay.
Harry Siemens asks, some farm organizations in Canada would love to see more positive direction and leadership from the feds on farm policy. How do you see it going?
I would like to see greater engagement, really, and that's something that, a message that we're delivering to our provincial government, for example, is we need to put agriculture on the table at the federal level. And I'm not sure we've seen that on things like the, some of the disruptions that we've seen, and CETA as an example. Are we talking to the Europeans about the lack of access to our largest manufacturing sector?
Just ask you a question that is, we discussed before the session. It's a little bit off topic from protectionism, but it is in the broader zeitgeist these days, immigration controls and the changes in immigration policies. Can you just elaborate from your perspective with the pork industry in Manitoba of the challenges that some of the changes in Canadian immigration policy are having on the sector?
I think that the top two issues for the industry right now are trade, global uncertainty, and labor. I understand why immigration is under the microscope, but the issues facing Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto are not the same as the issues that are facing Neepawa and Winnipeg and Brandon and Winkler, Manitoba. And they shouldn't be treated the same. And I think that's the concern that I have with labor, with the immigration and crossover to labor issues. Given the cutbacks in skilled labor and help for the industry coming in from places like the Philippines, it is going to be a constraint on productivity growth, and it is going to be a constraint on investment, no question.
Thank you. Well, if there are any other questions from the floor here, I think if that's the case, I think all of our presenters are going to remain here for the remainder of the morning. So, Trevor, I think you're going to be able to spend for the rest of the day here. So, rather than bringing all our speakers back together for one last opportunity for questions, let's stop right now and take a bit of a break. It's now about 22 minutes to 11. Shall we resume at 10:45 and just take a short bio break here, and we'll return at 11:45. Thank you very much, and thank you again. If we can have a round of applause for the presenters here for their excellent presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, welcome to session number 2 of today's proceedings. I'm Steve Pratt, and I'll be the session moderator for our panel, Transport of Food Products to the United States and Mexico. And just a bit of a housekeeping item, our agenda has changed slightly from what was published. We're going to have 2 speakers on this panel this morning, and so we should have ample time for questions and conversation after both presentations. So in keeping with the first panel's structure. We'll have our first presenter go, open it up, see what type of questions we get from both the floor and from online, and then we'll move on to our second presenter, and again, take questions, and then if there's opportunity and time allows, we can just have a conversation as we use the remainder of our time with both. So our first presenter this morning is Michael Mikulak. He's the Executive Director of the Food and Beverage Manitoba. And I got a bit of a bio here for Michael. He has spent 2 decades obsessed with how we grow, cook, transport, consume, and celebrate food, and the potential to leverage food systems to solve some of the biggest problems facing humanity: climate change, inequality, and biodiversity loss. What began as a PhD thesis on the 100-mile diet and the locavore movement took him through different parts of the food system. Michael spent over a decade teaching as an adjunct professor at McMaster, University of Guelph, and Laurier. He's written numerous articles in the book, The Politics of the Pantry, Stories, Food, and Social Change, and he's also the founder and owner of Common Ground Teaching Farm, an environmentally focused microfarm that teaches people how to grow, cook, and sustain themselves and the planet through nourishing food. After almost 2 decades away from Winnipeg, Michael's returned to the city he grew up in, has taken on the role of the Executive Director of the Food and Beverage Manitoba, where he leads a team that is supporting the food and beverage industry through advocacy, training, government relations, and capacity building. And so, Michael, I'll welcome you up here, please. And Michael's presentation is entitled Food Patriotism: Why Local Food Must Look Beyond Nationalism and Embrace the Global. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Nope. No, oh, you're using that? Oh, okay.
Yep, just using this. No slide deck.
Oh, no slide? Okay.
Yeah, no slide deck. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to go old school, no slide deck. Okay, so trying to get in here. I don't want to do something on this computer. Okay, so I'm taking a bit of a different approach today, and one that I think is going to focus a little bit on kind of the consumer side of things and kind of try to connect it into there, and sort of pick up this theme of kind of what's old is new again. So today I want to talk about this tension kind of between local and global food systems, and in particular in the way it's being mobilized, politicized, and some of the issues that I think are actually being conflated in ways that that really sort of undermine, I think, our broader goal, which is sort of stability, sustainability, and really sort of making sure that our food remains affordable and accessible to everybody. So we focus a lot on kind of global trade, and I will kind of come back to this as well, but I want to contextualize this in a couple of different ways. In particular, to sort of see how things have been sort of developing in my part of the world, which I'm often dealing with supporting kind of CPG brands and so consumer product goods. So they're often interacting with consumers much more directly. And we've seen some really sort of interesting kind of developments in that. So I think a lot of people who are exporting have seen a lot of uncertainty this year because of the trade chaos. But for a lot of the smaller brands that we represent at Food and Beverage Manitoba, it's actually ironically been quite a good year because of the attention for the Buy Canada, Buy Manitoba, Buy Local movement. A lot of Canadians have been sort of voting with their wallets, and you've seen things at the retail level where you've all of a sudden seen these kind of displays for local food. And I think we need to look at this kind of both as an opportunity, but also be critical about this. And that's sort of what I want to kind of unpack today. And I think often this binary between local and global, between small and big, between authentic and corporate is really kind of undermining, I think, some really crucial, productive dialogues that we need to have. And so I want to take this through a couple of different ways, again, with this kind of theory or this kind of lens of what's old is new. When I started doing my research into food systems, I actually came upon it kind of accidentally. I was actually more interested in sustainability and the way that public policy gets mobilized at that kind of grassroots level. So how do people think about things like sustainability, for example? How do they talk about it? How do they mobilize it in different parts of their lives? And that's kind of when I came to food. And right around the time, it was about 2005, 2006, I started doing my PhD. And there was this kind of local food movement, a grassroots food movement that was sort of happening. And it kind of was around, loosely around things like eating locally, the 100-mile diet, the farm-to-table movement that was becoming really popular within kind of restaurants and whatnot. And it was as much about creating kind of community spaces and ways to sort of understand the food system as it was about the food itself. And I think this is crucial. Cam said this, and a few of the other presenters said this. Most people don't understand our food system in any meaningful way. They sort of interact it at that end of, they go to the grocery store and they receive that food, and they don't understand how integrated that food system is, how big it is in terms of the Canadian economy, the global nature of it, the fact that we're exporting incredible amounts. They tend to think about it in those kind of small ways, in those micro interactions. And we saw that during the pandemic with the growth of farmers markets. We saw that with the growth of these kind of points of contact that people were having in these kind of individualistic ways. And I think this is powerful for leveraging understanding of the food system, but also really potentially kind of dangerous in the way that it oversimplifies things, right? Where we tend to say, oh, well, we can do X, we can feed ourselves in these ways, or we can't. And it kind of limits the way we talk about this. And I think it's important that we engage Canadians in this dialogue, in particular at this moment where I think there's this tension between kind of nationalism and patriotism and internationalism. We're seeing such a pullback away from globalization. And it's happening in a way that I think could undermine the goals, which I think, if we're talking about things like food sovereignty and we're talking about our ability to feed ourselves in the face of shock, right? So we're fundamentally talking about resilience. How do we create a more resilient food system? The first presentation of the day today, you talked a lot about this idea that we've experienced shock after shock after shock, right? So how do we create a food system that is more resilient? And this is going to be, very complicated and difficult, and it's going to involve everything from kind of the economic dimension to the environmental dimension. We haven't talked about it too much, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the environmental impact of the food system, which we see in the cost of fuel and fertilizer, is massive, right? It's something like 33% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of all biodiversity loss, 70% of water consumption. So as climate change accelerates, those shocks are only going to get worse. So it's not just the trade, it's not the economic, it's all these other pieces. The physical nature of our business, of what we do, of growing food and then transforming it into something that we can eat, is going to get worse. It's not going to get any better, right? And I think we need to figure out ways to leverage that transformation of the food system to be able to do this in productive ways. And part of that is connecting, I think, to consumers and helping them understand so that we can use that as a real tool. And I think for many years, especially when I started kind of working on my own dissertation, food miles was a metric that resonated with consumers. And it's something that's coming back, right? How far was something produced from where you're eating it, right? How close is it to you? How can you have that relationship with that individual? And it really sort of, it's a way of connecting people to it, but it can't stop there. And the reason that it can't stop there is that when you look at, say, the impact of the food system on the environment, even though food miles resonates with a lot of people, it's actually a tiny, tiny proportion of the overall impact of that food onto there. That transportation of food is something like 1% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So while it's important that we focus on it because it connects people to how that food is being produced, it really is sort of a red herring. In the same way that I would say often plastic packaging has become the same thing. It's such a small proportion of the overall impact of that food, and in actuality can end up leading to larger impacts if we impact, for example, the ability to maintain that freshness. If the shelf life of the food goes down because we replace it with a paper-based product, for example, we've just sort of completely undermined the attempt to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions, even though I think for most consumers, when they think about how do I make my food more sustainable, they think about food miles, right? They think about eating locally. And again, I'm not against this. As an association, we, for example, are heavily involved in promoting Manitoba Made. And I think this is an important part of what we need to do, and we will continue to do this. And I actually, I guess, kind of introduction to this during my dissertation was like, as I said, through the 100-mile diet. I actually did that for an entire year as part of that dissertation. And man, oh man, was it eye-opening. It really sort of showed me sort of some of the quirks of the food system to someone who never came from this background at all. I have no background in this. And then when I came to it, and a couple of things that I'd like to point out. So number one was, I was studying at McMaster University, living in Southern Ontario. This is an area that does produce a large amount of food, right? And a large amount of food that people can actually eat, right? So it's not just sort of like commodities that are being exported. And at one point, I remember I was looking for beans. I wanted to go find some local produced beans, and I could see them. I saw them growing in the fields around my house. I was like, how hard is it going to be to find beans? It was incredibly difficult. I started calling around, and this was partly an artificial constraint. I was trying to eat 100% local for an entire year. And this was before there was the locavore movement was particularly popular, so it was actually quite difficult to find some of these commodities. So even things like bread, I had to learn to bake myself. I couldn't actually get any local bread that was 100% local. And beans was another one. At that point, I was vegetarian. And so trying to find the beans, I thought this is going to be important. So I started calling some distributors. And I was like, okay, can I buy some beans from you? So there was first distributor I talked to. He said, sure. How many tons would you like? Tons? I'm like, why are you selling it in tons? Well, it's like, we export exclusively to the EU market because the beans that are produced in Ontario at that point, Ontarians aren't willing to pay the prices that Europeans are. So we have no local distribution for these beans. We export them entirely, and even though we produce them all here. And that was my first sort of, okay, what's happening here and why? And at that point, they did me a favor. They sold me, I think, a 50-pound bag of beans that I split with some other locavores, and we were able to sort of get some of our protein in there. I did actually have to start eating meat at that point because my protein options were so limited at that point, so I actually did end up starting to eat meat. And once again, I want to sort of emphasize that kind of connection was important for me in my own journey at that point, and for many of the people that I was working with, and I think is an important kind of emotional connection that people have to there. And I think especially as things become more vibe-based in terms of our decision-making, I think we have to be able to leverage some of those feelings. And I think if you look at the kind of consumer trust barometer around food systems, who are the most kind of trusted players in that food system? It's the farmers, right? And so those producers, if you can kind of anchor some of this, I think it's important. But again, I want to emphasize, food miles are not as important as you think when it comes to creating a more sustainable system. And when it comes to the sort of economic impact, I think we forget, and Cam talked about this a lot, and same when we were talking about canola, the impact of the food system in a place like Canada is so driven by exports. we are an export country. We can't, when it comes to certain things, we actually can't feed ourselves with certain food, and we must export. And there's, I would say, a moral obligation to do this as the world increases in population, as people are looking for more food, as they're looking for more food, and they're trying to increase their protein intake and whatnot. We do need to sort of step up as a country, and there's a lot of opportunities when it comes to this. And I think, again, where we get into where things can get tripped up is when we're talking about resilience in an era of disruption. What does that look like? What does it mean? How do we tap into these things? And I think this concept of onshoring that's becoming so popular in manufacturing, we really need to unpack that and to sort of say that it can't be either or, it has to be both. That we have to onshore more of our production, and that there is a strategic importance to being able to feed ourselves. I think we're going to see this increase in the discourse around food sovereignty as a form of defense, right? And it'll be interesting to see if the federal government, we've announced pretty significant commitments to defense spending increase. And I think there's an expectation around many people that some of that might be some of these adjacent industries that are part of that, right? So that could be food, that could be looking at making sure that certain parts of our, of our infrastructure, our ability to create vaccines, other things like that, are kind of looped into that broader discourse about it. But again, and I'm not going to belabor this point because I think Cam did a really good job of this, the size of this industry is very poorly understood by people. It is the largest manufacturing sector in the country. We employ something like 10% of the population, right? It's massive, massive, and it spreads across every jurisdiction, right? It's in every rural community, it's in every city, it's everywhere. And the proportion of that's being exported out is very large. Over $100 billion is exported annually. And 62% of that is going to the United States. They will never be replaced, right? And multiple people have said this today, but I think it's really important to sort of emphasize that. They will not be replaced. So while that local food and eating locally, while it's absolutely important, and I think we can actually increase the opportunities for small and medium-sized producers by enhancing that, it's really important to not lose our sight on our role globally in feeding the world and in sort of making sure that we have enough of that. And I think we often talk about local food as a cultural or moral imperative, as a cultural or moral choice, something that we do that makes us feel good, that we connect, we can shake the hand of the farmer that we've met, or that's producing that food. But we also need to think about it as an economic engine. That local food, we've all heard about the kind of ripple and multiplier effects when you buy food locally, the way that it kind of ripples through the economy. There's a lot of different studies about it, but it can be a 1.5 up to 2.6 time kind of multiplier. It creates lots of jobs within that whole supply chain. And we can't forget that. And I think we can invest in those things. And especially at these moments where, I think thinking about infrastructure is so important. And I think there's a real reality check when it comes to that. So we have about 300 members at Food and Beverage Manitoba. About 80% of them have 10 employees or less. Okay, so this is a sector that's dominated by numbers by those small and medium-sized producers. In fact, I would call them micro producers in that. And that's not just Manitoba, that's actually across the board, across Canada, right? So while there are very large companies that are producing incredible quantities of food, when it comes to the kind of the numbers into there, it's there. So how do we help those companies scale up and grow? How do we help those companies access new markets, diversify, feed more Canadians, and to do it at a scale that actually also addresses something else, which is the food inflation, right? Canadians care when they go to the grocery store, they're primarily concerned with taste, then price, then things like where it came from, where it was grown, and then other things like sustainability, ethics, organic standards, things like that. Those come sort of later. So we need to make sure that if people are interested in this thing, if we're engaging them, that we also have ways to scale these things up, right? Things like lack of cold storage, co-packing, certified kitchens, all of these kinds of things for that scale up for those small to medium-sized companies. Without those, they can't grow. They will remain in those kind of niche categories. And so if we want to increase the resilience of our food system and buffer ourselves against future shocks, whatever that looks like, whether it's a trade war, climate disruptions. This summer, look at the forest fires we had, right? Look at the droughts that we've had in the last few years. All of these things are only going to get worse. If we want to create more of that resilience, we have to be able to invest in infrastructure that allows those companies to keep more of that. So whether it's local abattoirs where people can slaughter animals at a smaller scale, whether it's institutional purchasing, so at the schools and the universities and other institutions, whether it's helping small processors reach new markets through certification, coaching, co-manufacturing, or creating things like food hubs where they can come in, aggregate that food, develop it at scale, and then ship it outside of the border. I think it's absolutely crucial that we take a look at this movement, at this interest in the buy local, buy Canadian, buy Manitoba, and use it to help these companies grow and scale. Small is beautiful, but we can't stop there. We have to be able to help with that scale, and it has to be connected to those global issues. In particular, at a time where I think people are becoming more nationalistic, right? Like we have to find ways to reconnect the world, right? To be able to engage folks in that kind of internationalism during this time. So I think there's a risk of thinking too local when it comes to these things. And that kind of, as I said, that economic nationalism, that protectionism, that vulnerability can be challenged by something like food and the way that it connects us. It brings us to this shared table. And I think the only way to do this is to make sure that we are supporting increased diversification in markets, that we're supporting companies, small, large, and medium sized, to be able to grow and to do this, to scale up, to invest in critical infrastructure like food hubs that are going to provide pathways, and to do that in a way that has the highest level of food safety certification so that we don't undermine our reputation as being a high quality exporter of foods. We need to sort of make sure that we are actively connecting that kind of national and local resilience, and that we can do this in a way that's both responsible, but that also maintains that level of trust with both our local, with people in Canada and internationally. And again, that common infrastructure, whether it's cold chain or support for co-packing, things like that, are really going to be crucial to helping us get to that. And so I think as we try to figure how to navigate out of this current shock, let's not waste this moment. Let's not waste this crisis to help us create a much more resilient food system that, again, recognizes the absolute scale, size, and impact that agri-food and agri-food processing has on the economy. As an association, something that we're doing is really sort of advocating for the creation of these kinds of food hubs to be able to do this, the shared use scaling up, and really thinking about things like climate resilience through the lens of localization and trade diversification, to make sure that these things are being connected. Because whether it's going to be border closures, droughts, fires, cyber attacks, I think the new normal is that supply chains are going to be stretched thin as we move forward. And so finding ways to do this. And I think, again, leveraging things like local procurement, it can't be the end of it. We can't, I think someone said this, we're never going to eat our way out of this, right? If you think about the size, for example, of the pork industry or the canola industry, Canadians can't eat all the things that we produce, even though there is a large market, right? I think you mentioned that there's 500 million tons that increased just from biofuel production. So there's definitely opportunities here. And so I think I feel hopeful that this moment right now where we're focusing in on this largely invisible system that we take for granted, that feeds us relatively inexpensively despite recent inflation, is opportunity to think about it as a powerful lever to both connect us internationally, to address some of these issues like climate change, and to really and to do it in a way that that kind of can support the local and the global at once.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. I'm looking, we don't have any specific questions from the chat right now, so I'll throw it open to the floor. We have a roving mic. Barry.
My first question has to do with interprovincial trade barriers. Now, I'm not sure whether I read this or dreamt this, that the federal regulations on meat inspection and provincial regulations were either going to be somehow merged, or that we're going to be at least able to sell provincial products across the nation. I point this out because I was very surprised when I came here how many sausage producers there actually were in Manitoba and in Winnipeg, because of all these ethnic backgrounds.
Yep.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's really interprovincial trade is very complicated, and I think when it comes to something like food, which is heavily regulated, we have to be really careful about how we approach this. Right now, no provincial standard meets CFIA or the federal standards at all, and the two-tiered system is really useful in the sense that it's kind of risk-based. So if you're producing a sausage, let's stay with that, and it's being consumed locally, there's a lot less risk associated with that. And sausage might not be the greatest example because it's considered a high-risk food. But let's say, like you're baking bread or cookies or something like that. It's a fairly low-risk food, and when you're producing locally, for local consumption, the risk of making a large part of the population sick or something like that is fairly low. And so I think in those cases, having that two-tier system is really important. Once you start leaving the province, once you start shipping and using longer supply chains, it becomes really important to be able to do things like traceability, to conduct a recall, to have much higher safety standards for food. So our opinion at the association is that instead of focusing in on reducing, that's not a trade barrier. Anybody can trade interprovincially. They have to meet the higher standards, and there's a good reason for that. And so we should be helping the small and medium-sized producers reach those standards rather than bringing them down, because by bringing them down, not only do we risk the health and safety of Canadians, we also risk our reputation internationally as being one of the safest food systems in the world. So we have to proceed with caution when it comes to those kinds of things.
Bruce.
Yeah, Michael, you mentioned co-packing a few times in there.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just maybe just expand on exactly what that is and how it relates to the significance in building resiliency?
Yeah, so co-packing, food is a very difficult industry to make it. As I said, we have a lot of small and micro producers, and so to be able to transition from that small scale where maybe you're packing in, you're in a community kitchen or you have a small scale facility, to get to the point where you're at national distribution is very expensive. So you have to invest in a facility yourself, you have to do something. One of the paths for a lot of people is co-packing. So instead of having your own facility, you contract it out. So you bring the recipe, your marketing, all of those things to a co-packer, and that co-packer will make the product for you and charge you for that, and then and then distribute it out. So it's a crucial point for a lot of people. They might not necessarily invest in their own factory. They might have co-packers around. So a good example is something like tomahawk chips. We've probably seen them around here. Well, chips are hard to transport because they're so big, right? It's a lot of air. So like tomahawk chips has basically co-packers across the entire country and then ship out from there. So they don't produce all the chips in Manitoba and then ship them out. They produce all the way across the country at different co-packers, and they just provide the recipe and whatnot. It's actually a really important step for a lot of companies, and Manitoba lacks co-packing capacity, I would say, compared to some other provinces. But it is that important kind of step forward. And it can also help diversify other companies who might not have, for example, might not be running at full capacity. So you might have a plant where you're only running at 50% capacity. Co-packing is a way to help diversify your revenue stream.
I have a question for you, Michael. During your research and your lived experience, if you will, can you make any comments about now that you did that and you've moved on from that? Can you make any comments just about the general price of eating that way and procuring your food?
Yeah, so honestly, it was, well, I mean, the experiment, let's call it, it wasn't, price was definitely like, it was more expensive. It was time. It was absolutely time. It was doing everything from scratch. It was it was taking the time to find it. Cost is, I think, has come down in some ways for some of those local options, not always, but it is absolutely a barrier. And I think we have to keep that in mind that on the one hand, we pay less for food now than we ever have in all of history, right? If you look at the proportion of our income that we spend on food, it's significantly lower than anywhere else. And I would argue in some cases you could look at it and say that that food is cheap compared to that. On the other hand, it's clear that it is very difficult for many Canadians to meet that kind of affordability criteria. So balancing those two things out and having those options is absolutely crucial. And that's where I think that artificial binary between small and big, between kind of the corporate and the kind of more quote unquote authentic is it's important to unpack that and to not, and I think you're seeing that play out right now in a lot of the dialogues in particular in the United States around things like consumer choice, around things like raw milk and other things like that, where they want to say, oh, I feel comfortable with this because I want to shake the hand of the farmer. And like, it's very dangerous, I think, to kind of slip into that kind of trust because you see the person versus trust because they've gone through like certain steps and whatnot. So, yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions from the floor?
Michael, one question. You talked about food hubs. Mm-hmm. If you could expand on that, it sounds interesting.
Yeah, so Food Hub is kind of an aggregation point. What we're working on is called Marketlands Food Hub, and it is a place where you would have a shared use facility that allows for people to rent it out by station, by the hour, and have access to professional level equipment in a kitchen that is HACCP certified, so it meets the highest standard, so you can get out of the province immediately from that. So what it does is it de-risks by essentially investing in shared infrastructure at that point and allowing for the aggregation of ingredients and kind of reducing those costs. So a good example would be a few producers could come together and say, we're going to order a truckload of flour, sugar, whatever it is that you're doing, and then share the cost across multiple people and share the cost across the equipment. So you're not buying your own product or your own piece of equipment. You're sharing it across multiple, and it helps you get through that kind of growth phase where you're getting into national distribution, essentially. It is and it isn't. Some of them are based on co-op models. Most aren't. Most are sort of run by an organization that then rents out the facility in different ways. There's a lot of different models. It can be a co-op. It can be run as a co-op. A lot of them are also connected to local farming communities as well, but not necessarily. You can have them connected to and say, okay, we're going to only buy food locally, but a lot of them also say we're going to bring in all the different ingredients that we need and go up there. But it's that crucial kind of intermediary step where you can, before you open your own facility and it's dedicated.
Okay, another question from the floor?
You know, I was thinking about your 100-mile diet, and you know, a lot of the things that we like to consume, fruits and vegetables, are not grown here. You must have eaten a lot of turnips, perhaps in your time. Yep. But we do see more production of vertical farming, lettuce.
Yep.
In fact, I was surprised to see greenhouse tomatoes coming from Manitoba. Can you speak a little bit about that part of the market?
Yeah, it's super interesting. One of the chapters in my book was focused in on vertical farming. Now, this was a while ago, so there's been a lot of technological changes that have happened since then. I think it's a real interesting technology and there's a lot of promise around it, but let's be clear, it will never replace field grown at scale for a lot of things. The cost associated, the electricity, all of that, like even though you get huge benefits in terms of say like water usage, other things like that, it is very, very difficult to do that for an entire thing. So I think there's a huge role for it to play, to diversify. I think we should be investing in some of these things and we're seeing more of it, but it's kind of, I think it's kind of a techno-utopian dream to think that we're going to somehow produce all of our food that way. It's only going to work for high value products for the most part. And I think it will be supplement. I think something like lettuce greens are a great example. It works really well for them because you can do them very quickly. It's fairly intensive. It's short. You can grow a crop in 30 days, and you can kind of have that constant turnover. And it's a crop that's highly perishable and is traveling long distances. So for certain crops, it's going to work. But I remember when I was doing my research, people talking about how we were going to grow fields of wheat in these vertical farms, right? And things like that. It's not going to happen, right? So I think it's a matter of where and how it's going to fit in. And I think we have to resist the urge to look for silver bullets that are going to fix everything. I think it's an important part of it. I think in northern communities in particular, there's a role for it to play where they're shipping in at extreme costs. But then it also has to be culturally appropriate, that people have to want to eat that. You're not just going to say, hey, ex-northern community, here's a bunch of kale. Right? Like it has to be tied into the desires and needs of that community and really be driven from that kind of grassroots approach.
I don't think we can count on climate change to alter the production of avocados.
I do have a question and a comment for you here from our participants online, Michael. So if you can you share any insights on if it is more profitable for the country and its consumers to buy exported rather than local food?
I mean, I think that's really case by case. Like, I think in some cases, there's absolutely a benefit to be doing it. I mean, this is sort of classic economics and just sort of being able to leverage what some countries do better. We can't grow everything into here. So I think for certain products, absolutely. But I think where it gets complicated is those ripple effects and what is the purpose of the food system and how should we be thinking about it in terms of things like sovereignty and security and other things like that. So I think sometimes we conflate those kinds of, whether it's cheaper in some ways, and especially when you think about things like externalities. And so I think it's very difficult to do that. But I remember early on when I was doing my research, reading up about like things like apples in the UK. Like, it was an early study that was done on food miles, and they were like, it's actually better for us to bring in to ship in apples from New Zealand that have been stored on a rather than doing it in the UK. And they did the full life cycle analysis of it, and sometimes it can be quite surprising when you look at certain things where you're like, oh wow, when you actually crunch the numbers on a full life cycle analysis, sometimes exporting makes more sense, sometimes doing it locally makes more sense, but it's not a one size fits all.
Thanks. Any other questions from the floor before we move on with our next panelist? I do have one comment here. I'm not sure if you want to make any response to this, but it's a prompt for you not to forget to invite everyone here to your Food and Beverage Manitoba holiday party. It's a very interesting
That's
annual
probably
event.
one of my staff members. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Michael.
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, for our second panelist, I'm going to call up Aaron Doliniak. He's the Executive Director of the Manitoba Trucking Association. And over at the association, Aaron leads the MTA's government relations and advocacy efforts. He has spearheaded initiatives including the RPM Trucking Industry Safety Program, a workforce development strategy with Manitoba's Sector Council, and the New Entrant Training Program, each contributing to improved safety and regulatory alignment. With over 15 years of experience in strategic planning and stakeholder engagement, Aaron builds strong partnerships between industry and government to advance the trucking sector in the province. And Aaron's presentation today is titled Trucking in Times of Change, Tariffs, and Crisis. Welcome, Aaron.
Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about external factors that have been impacting the trucking industry over the last number of years, from the pandemic till today. A little bit about internal factors, some of which are maybe a bit alarming and shocking, but I think very important to talk about. Current status of industry, and then hopefully leave you with some key insights to take away. So I'll start out by playing a little video that communicates who the MTA is and what we do.
24/7, 365, rain or shine, our industry is up and running. Manitoba trucking companies work tirelessly to provide businesses and communities with what they need. But they deserve more than praise. They deserve support. The Manitoba Trucking Association was made by our industry for our industry, so we can work together to help improve our industry for everyone. From one-truck operations to large fleets, the MTA works with members to ensure our voices are heard on issues that affect our future. MTA acts as a resource to help navigate regulations locally, nationally, and even internationally. Companies have received millions of dollars in savings and rebates as a result of the MTA's advocacy efforts. From representing industry at all levels of government and promoting career opportunities to the next generation, to work towards a greener industry. Let MTA be your support, and let's work together with other members to create the future we all want to see for our industry. Let MTA be your support, and let's work together with other members to create the future we all want to see for our industry. Become a member today. Join us at trucking.mb.ca.
So the MTA exists to advocate, support, and educate to create a safe and healthy business environment for the trucking industry. So to do that, I've listed a number of things here. I'll just maybe talk about some highlights. Advocacy is pretty self-explanatory. Communication is extremely key in our industry. I think we talked about, some people labeled it shocks to industry. Well, for us, that means changing regulations, sometimes by the minute, sometimes by the day. Our members need help in understanding how to navigate that. And then also training. We don't do driver training at the MTA. We do all sorts of compliance, occupational health and safety, and workforce development training, and we train over 3,000 people a year. So membership in our association is voluntary. We have more than 320 companies operating more than 53,000 trucks across North America, from one-truck operators to trucking companies with thousands of trucks, representing all segments of industry, urban, rural, specialized, general freight, and so forth. So it's also important to point out that the MTA is part of a federation of provincial trucking associations that come together to create the Canadian Trucking Alliance. And this gives our members a voice on municipal, provincial, national, and international issues. So just a couple of items of note before we get on. There's some very smart people in the room, and I'm not going to profess to be an economist, but I'm going to talk a lot about supply and demand and the impacts on our industry. And a lot of economists use the trucking industry as an economic indicator of what is ahead for the rest of the economy. And then the last thing I'll leave you with here as a sort of just a note is, trucking is highly competitive. In Manitoba, we have more than 2,200 companies registered in the province. Some of those are dependent contractors, but most of those have their own operating authority. And whether they work for somebody else or not, represent trucking companies. So getting into some of the external factors that have been influencing the industry over the last number of years, I'll start by showing this chart. And I will say that the scales, there's two scales on here, and one of them exaggerates the red line a little bit. And what we are comparing here is freight rates in red to freight volumes in blue. And I wanted to put this up because it really demonstrates the roller coaster in which our industry has been through over the last number of years, and currently, quite frankly, on a downward trajectory on. So let's start out with the pandemic. I think we all remember that and are sick and tired of talking about it. But the reality was there was an immense amount of change, right? We had a shutdown, everything closed up. We saw freight volumes plummet, freight rates plummet. What is the new normal going to look like? A whole bunch of uncertainty at the beginning. And then as things progressed, I think society saw the essential role that the supply chain played, and everybody felt the pressures applied to the supply chain, whether it be factories that were shut down because of restrictions, delays at borders, new rules at borders. We saw, all sorts of operational challenges. I remember myself making phone calls to restaurants to plead with them to allow truck drivers into their facilities, right? And then towards the middle tail end of the pandemic, we saw, labor shortages as well as equipment shortages, right? The price of a used truck, for example, went from about $40,000 a unit to $80,000 or $100,000 a unit, and interest rates were really high. So we can sort of see that in the dip in 2020, and then obviously 2021 it peaks up a little bit higher than that. And then another thing that takes place, the 2021 atmospheric river floods in BC, which washed out highways and rail lines, basically severing our country in half. We saw a massive spike in demand in our industry. We also saw a spike in new entrants to our industry. And one story I will tell is, pre-pandemic, typically a load from, say, Calgary to lower mainland BC would be somewhere between $1,000 to $2,000. Well, during this period, I often heard stories of loads costing $12,000, right? Industry navigated it. We worked on secondary highways, and we worked the United States to actually move goods, what we call in transit, Canadian goods, say from Manitoba down to the States and then north up into BC at Canadian weights, which is quite frankly unprecedented, and I don't believe anything's happened before or since to that extent. So speaking to the rapid industry growth that we saw, here's some data from Manitoba Public Insurance. So between 2018 and to the end of 2022, we saw commercial registrations grow by 59% in Manitoba, which is also unprecedented. Looking at long-haul trucking, what we call IRP fleets or fleets that operate in many jurisdictions, that grew by 26%, which is also a very large amount. As said, demand was peak over this period. Companies and individuals, quite frankly, overpaid for equipment, like I mentioned earlier. Companies were also desperate for labor. And I'll just say that, some less than reputable carriers were taking the opportunity to cut corners and maximize profits. So we can see that in this peak. Right in the middle of 2022, the washouts took place right at the end of 2021. So next was a freight recession, right? As the pandemic, I'll call it finished, companies had stocked up on supplies because of the uncertainty that was created throughout the pandemic. So companies were not purchasing because they were worried about supply chain disruptions. They had the supply, so it's going to take some time to, whittle that down and sell it off. And coupled with lower consumer demand, as society had more options on how to spend money, we saw, volumes start to decline and rates decline with it. To give you an indicator today, this 2025 statistic is from August, excess capacity in industry, right? Our industry grew really fast and quite frankly was at a point that was not sustainable. And here today, or recently, we have 4.2 trucks available for every load in the Canadian market. Equilibrium is typically considered, 1.5 to 2 trucks to ensure our industry can serve the needs of the economy. So we are, currently more than double that. Things couldn't get worse, low volumes, low rates, and now the uncertainty of Trump and tariffs. Our industry has been hit extremely hard. We've seen a further freight volume collapse, layoffs, financial stress, higher equipment costs, and quite frankly, long-term uncertainty. I was just talking to a member the other day, and their focus is hauling equipment, whether it be agricultural equipment, construction equipment. And what they've seen is, between July and August, a 50% reduction in freight volumes because companies they're not going to make big purchases if they don't know what things are going to cost 6-8 months in the future when they're delivered. So now getting a little bit to some of the internal factors that have been influencing our industry. I would characterize them as, quite frankly, a lack of regulatory accountability. The trucking industry is highly competitive. We need strong regulations that are enforced to ensure that our industry can remain competitive. We've seen some less than reputable companies purposely breaking safety laws, involved in human trafficking in the form of labor trafficking. Driver Inc. is what our industry coins misclassification of labor. And I'll get into those things a little bit in more detail here. So as our industry grew, we have a finite labor force, and becoming a truck driver is not something that happens overnight. Typically takes a minimum of 121 and a half hours and somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 just to do the starting point, which is obtaining a Class 1 license. Much of the meaningful training takes place once you have a license and are working for a carrier through mentorship and additional training. Many fleets chose to, not focus on that, put people on the highways that, quite frankly, are legally allowed to be on the highways, but from a risk perspective, it's just not good practice. Many fleets have been forcing their drivers to work more hours than what are, quite frankly, legally allowed. In Canada, we have federal hours of service regulations, which, control how many hours a driver can drive in the day. We also have something called electronic logging devices that should be a check and balance limiting, I'll say, fraud in this area, but companies and individuals have found unique ways of cutting corners and manipulating these laws and rules. And then obviously, under-maintained equipment. So let's get into labor trafficking a little bit. I know there were some comments about immigration earlier. I will say immigration has long been, very important to the industry. It still continues to be, but it needs to be done properly. From our perspective, we're seeing over the last 5 years, for sure, a spike in illegal activity in this area. Quite frankly, companies are charging head taxes on foreign workers, ranging from $15,000 to $50,000. My understanding is that is the sort of the going rate right now is somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 each. When these individuals get here, they're paid much less than the going rate. And I will say it's a bit more complicated in our sector because drivers are paid by the mile. So when you have a federal immigration officer trying to compare hourly wages to somebody that's getting paid by the mile, they don't necessarily understand that 20 cents per mile is a lot less than minimum wage. A lot of these individuals are paying rent and having that deducted off of their checks to live in houses that they're barely in, having food deducted as well, and then having had passports held by employers. I've heard, direct circumstances where this has taken place. And then many of these individuals are threatened with potential deportation if they speak up or complain about it. So you may have seen billboards on the way here today. We have a project or a campaign, I'll say, in joint with the Joy Smith Foundation and Crime Stoppers, trying to create awareness on labor trafficking and trucking. Many people would agree that they see things that don't make sense, and we want people to look at those things that don't make sense more critically and give them an opportunity to report bad behavior and, quite frankly, illegal behavior. So misclassification of labor, our industry coins it as Driver Inc., but I'll just sort of summarize it as paying people under the table to do a job. So for contract workers, there is no paper trail that exists between an employer and the CRA. So there's no way for the CRA to detect if somebody's being improperly paid. So that the whole purpose of this scheme is to avoid, payroll deductions, taxes, CPP, EI, vacation costs, sick time, all of that. And it amounts to a 30 to 35% competitive advantage on labor compared to a company that follows the rules and does things properly. Here is a snip of an ad that the federal labor program, ESDC, has on their website. Speaking to it being illegal, it is, but the sad reality is the consequences are very minimal right now. So getting into the current status of our industry, legitimate companies who follow the rules, quite frankly, are at a competitive disadvantage in today's marketplace. Most companies are not profitable or just marginally profitable at the moment. Industry is seeking more enforcement and accountability. You don't hear that very often from industry associations, but we've been advocating for more enforcement everywhere. We believe that an overhaul of the temporary foreign worker program is quite frankly desperately needed and more accountability built into it. And then the last thing I'll say is industry economists that I've spoken to recently feel that, the statistics so far don't really show the impact of the tariffs. Q3 and Q4 of this year is when we're going to see it. And the reason being, we had spikes in freight volumes in the first 2 quarters because of shippers and receivers trying to get freight across the border before tariffs came into place, creating an artificially high volume for those months. Just wanted to sort of present something to you here too that speaks to the current freight rate market here in Canada and the United States. So this table is a snip from an annual report that's put together from the American Transport Research Institute, and they do an annual report on the costs of trucking. So what we see here is per mile in US dollars rates, and the bottom right we can see the average cost of a general freight company in North America. So this sample for this includes some Canadian carriers, but there's hundreds of thousands of freight carriers in this sample. So it's a good, broad, general perspective of what it costs to run a truck down the road. $2.26 per mile. So this is as of the end of 2024. I looked and found some spot rate market notes on what the going rate for freight is over the same period of time, and we can see it's $2 per mile. So it kind of speaks to the position that our industry is in right now. In a lot of cases, carriers are moving freight at a loss. I want to talk a little bit about profit margins. I know there was some discussion about retailers earlier, 4% profit margin. 4% in our industry is really good. Companies strive to get 4% in good market situations. Today, like I said, I would say it's probably under 1%. But you put that into context, to make $5,000 of profit, that's $125,000 of freight that you need to sell. So some key insights. This kind of came up earlier, I think in the first presentation. We often feel blamed as a reason for price increases of other products, right? We all agree that fuel is a huge part of freight costs, but I think I've demonstrated here that freight costs are, the same or lower than they were 6 years ago, and freight costs have actually been going down. So I don't think it's fair when trucking gets blamed for price increases in retail, quite frankly. And I would argue that trucking rates are artificially lower than they should be because of a lot of these bad actors in our industry taking that price floor and sinking it down yet further. Another key insight, the old saying goes, you can have it fast, cheap, or you can have it high quality, pick two. The same is true for the trucking industry, but I'll say there are grave consequences to accepting low quality service providers. And then lastly, if you're purchasing transportation services that seem to be lower cost, there's likely a good reason for it. You may be inadvertently supporting labor trafficking, misclassification, or poor safety. I think we can all do better than what's taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That was a very insightful and frank presentation. Again, I'm going to encourage folks online to drop anything in the chat. We have a roving mic for those in the room. And maybe as we're just waiting to get rolling here, I do have a question that came in from the chat, and starts with a comment to you, Aaron. Great reality check presentation, and means that this is confirming this person's conversation with truckers and former local truck owners. Question being, what do you see will help rebuild the legal and ethical trucking industry, not putting down those who are already operating that way?
I think accountability, quite frankly. Misclassification has an easy solution. There needs to be a paper trail for employment in our industry to ensure that people are meeting their tax obligations and the appropriate payroll deductions. On the labor trafficking front, we need better awareness. And we need to improve the temporary foreign worker program in Canada. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be expertise, industry expertise on how to deal with trucking, for example. Because of the misunderstanding of how our industry pays employees and some of the, I'll say, complexities of our industry, I don't think it's intentional. It's just a lack of understanding.
Looking out to the floor, Barry.
Yeah, I did a study at the Transport Institute, it must be 20 years ago now, and we looked at the economic impact of the trucking industry in Manitoba. Of course, most trucking from Manitoba, it's a big center for trucking, and you're 100 kilometers south or a couple of 100 kilometers either way, you're outside the province. So actually, a lot of our revenues are earned outside the province. Of course, they don't get counted as an export because these are services. But we looked at if they were an export, trucking came in something like the third largest export from Manitoba was trucking services, which is something, again, like the food industry and its role in the economy is not always appreciated how big and important this market actually is.
I think that's a good comment because I would say many of our members, 60 to 80% of their miles are south of the border.
Has that changed a great deal since in the last year? Are we seeing some change in the volume?
In some segments, yes. In others, no. When we think about refrigerated freight and general freight, there's still things we need to purchase. There's still things we need to sell. And I think it was put very well earlier, the U.S. is our neighbor. That's not going away. Quite frankly, our industry moves your products, right? So, yeah.
One thing I have been reading about the U.S. Trucking industry is the ICE. I'm not sure what that stands for anymore, but the issue of drivers that are not documented now not wanting to drive trucks because they get picked up, and even new Americans who are property in the U.S., but they fear getting picked up. So the trucking industry in the U.S. has lost about 1% of its drivers. Does the industry in Canada have a problem with truckers going south of the border who are new Canadians?
Yes, I'll say that is one of those issues where English and French language is important to be able to operate a truck. Have some fleets maybe not done as much as they could to ensure that their people are properly qualified. I would agree with that. I think there's more our industry needs to do in some areas. Some of it's intentional, some of it's not. Have we seen impacts on that? Absolutely, we have. There are, I'll say, Canadian permanent residents and those here on temporary foreign worker permits that are fearful of, quite frankly, being banned from the United States and having their loads impounded. So I'd say from an industry perspective, it is having an impact. Fleets are looking seriously at who they're sending south of the border. And I would also say, there is probably a need and an opportunity for us as a country to ensure that we're doing better in that front, because I think we're going to see more pressure from the United States in this area on our foreign workers going into the States.
Aaron, I have a quick question and follow-up to Barry, and then I'm going to move to one on the chat. Just moving up to 30,000 feet from Barry's question, this concept of, with the new focus or renewed focus on border security, not just the status of the driver, but just that kind of concept of regulatory thickening in general. Do you have any comments about the ability of, I'm thinking more even the safety stuff, weights and dimensions. Has there been a regulatory thickening for Canadian carriers going into the States, or is it actually in a good place, barring what you just referred to?
Not yet, but we're expecting it. And I think that is probably the cross-border segment of industry. That's probably our biggest fear right now. We would like the provinces and the federal government to raise the bar because we have regulations that are in place. The challenge, quite frankly, is they're not properly enforced.
Thanks. Maybe while folks are still percolating with questions here, one from the chat. Some of the statistics that you put up on the screen and the info reflected in them, are these universal for all types of freight, or do the incidents of the quote-unquote bad actors, do they vary by industry or freight type?
I would say yes, there are segments of industry that maybe don't have as much because they're not necessarily as accessible as startups, right? As for regions, I'll just say Manitoba is unique in that we have probably the largest trucking industry per capita in Canada because of our geographical location. I believe the one province that has more is New Brunswick, and that's because they have a very low population and a very large fleet, which also operates many trucks here in Manitoba. So when you look at our geography, I would say we feel it here. Southern Ontario feels it a lot, and Lower Mainland BC feels it a lot.
We have another question from the floor over here, Chris.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for your presentation. Chris Revate from the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association. I understand that GHG emissions from transportation in Canada and really any other country globally is about 20 to 30%. That's inclusive of things like trucking and rail, et cetera. Just wondering if your association is taking a look at GHG emissions for the sector and any steps that you might be taking to reduce those, and maybe even a more specific question, how realistic are EVs in the trucking industry?
Good questions. Not easy answers, I'll say. Are we working? Absolutely. I'll say right now we're working on something, hopefully, to do some pilot projects in the near future on hydrogen. Our industry is really interested about the future of hydrogen. Manitoba is uniquely positioned in that regard. So I'll say I'm excited about that. Technology is still evolving, so it's early days. I would say the bigger picture, when you look at zero emissions technologies, they all require electricity here in Manitoba. So what we need to start looking at is how are we going to have the electrical grid capacity to consider EVs and heavy-duty trucks, right? Yes, you can get what they call blue hydrogen from the oil sands and so forth, but if we're really talking about zero emissions, we need to start thinking outside the box and start demand planning for electricity. What was the second part of your question, sorry?
Just with regards to, do you see EVs being a realistic option in the 10, 15-year horizon for big rigs?
I think it's all price competitiveness, quite frankly. Like when you look at there's a battery electric truck sitting at a dealership right now in Manitoba. It's $600,000. It's designed to be used in like a drayage environment, right? Return to base, short haul. Well, the reality is that same truck in a diesel is $40,000, right? So how do you make that make economic sense? It's not just us. Our industry is purchases of equipment. We support you folks in what you want, moving your goods. So it's kind of a partnership. If industries want cleaner transportation, industries need to pay for it.
We have another question here from the floor.
Aaron, you know who I am. I missed part of your presentation. I'm Dr. Parsons. I teach logistics at the University of Manitoba Asper School, and Paul Larson, I, and Deepika Kalari looked exactly at that question. Aaron, bang, is right on. Electricity for heavy-duty applications is probably a no-go. The cost per energy, which is kilowatt hour, is really good. You know, blows diesel right out of the park. That's not the problem with electricity. The problem with electricity is the delivery. It's the kilowatts. That is strictly limited. And even in the US, Andrew Boyle, and I'm going to mention him, Andrew Boyle, who's the ATA's president across the United States, has made that point clearly to the US administration. Hydrogen doesn't suffer from the same problem. And in fact, there are, in Alberta, there's a couple of rigs on the go right now that are using hydrogen. It still has to meet price metrics, and the key one is getting the price down to $6. So yes, he's got it. What they're doing, though, just to mention, because I had some involvement in it, that industry is involved in the efficient trucking program. They've saved a huge amount of emissions. The other side of it, which connects to the oilseed, is the production of renewable diesel. So that has a big impact. But I think, Aaron, the question I wanted to ask, I wanted to make a couple of quick points, but the question is, look to the South. Like, a lot of the comparisons we're having is U.S. administration doesn't listen to us, but they do listen to their own industry. How would you characterize the situation of the American trucking associations, like under Mr. Boyle? How is their situation? Are they kind of worse than what we're facing, same as what we're facing, or maybe a little better?
In relation to decarbonization, just to be clear?
No, in terms of the trade situation.
I would say right now they're probably a little bit better than us, but that is likely to change. I think we're probably going to feel it quicker than they are. I had a conversation just a couple weeks ago with their chief economist. They feel that, you know, the last part of this year, everybody's going to feel it.
Follow,
a very quick one?
If I could just follow up on that, you know, when we see the downturn in trucking and rates and so on, that does cause any economist a lot of concern, because we do know it's a leading indicator. But to what degree was that downturn a function of maybe an over-entry into the industry, and it's now just adjusting back to where it should be rather than necessarily a wider economic issue?
It's hard to say. I would say we're not back to pre-pandemic, I'll say, total trucks, total drivers, total companies. We're still above that. So I would say there's still capacity in our market that's not needed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Michael. This has been a very interesting session, and I do hear the bells tolling. So perhaps with that, I'll turn it over to today's chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sit here? Yeah. We're going to do something a little different today. Rather than having a presentation, we thought we'd have a conversation. And so I have a few questions I'm going to ask, but also we'll just have a back and forth, and maybe a few from the audience as well. So I'm an old guy, so I'm going to sit down. Here, that feels better.
2 old guys.
2 old guys. Well, earlier it came up about if we're going to write a history of this industry, I know who the editor would be. Kurt Vossen has 48 years in the industry, just retired this year, a graduate in ag economics from the University of Saskatchewan, spent 18 years with Cargill, then 30 years as the CEO of Richardson International. So if anyone can speak authoritatively about the industry and what's changed, I think Kurt is in a great position. There are 30 years, matches the 30 years of the Fields on Wheels. And I can remember those first years in the Fields on Wheels that, oh boy, the grain industry and the grain transportation handling system was really a hotbed of activity in terms of debate. There were farmers who were being put in jail because they were taking wheat across the border, and the wheat board was a big issue. Removing oats from the wheat board was one of those topics that was out there, and certainly we saw the rationalization of the rail system, the branch line abandonment, and the communities. There was so much going on, including the question of the crow rate had just ended, and we had now the payment. Was it going to go to the farmers? Was it going to go to the railways? That was a pretty controversial period of time, as I recall. And it all seems to kind of gone away. And are we now in an industry that is just a regular supply chain, maybe a little even boring? What do you think?
Never boring, never boring. Well, just to go back to the beginning of the genesis of my particular involvement in this industry in Western Canada in particular, but that growing into a more of a global impact. You can't hear? Okay. Back in the late 70s, all of those indices that were really important, and you compare it to today, what was production in Western Canada? Grains, oilseeds, pulses, anywhere from 35 to 40, 30 to 40 million metric tons. We had not hundreds of grain elevator collection points, we had thousands of grain elevator collection points. Virtually all the facilities in Western Canada back in the late 70s were had been built in the decades prior, in some cases 60 to 70 years prior. Wood crib elevators, very, very commonplace in Western Canada. How did you transport bulk product? You did it primarily in box cars, and you modified those box cars to handle a bulk commodity by coopering the cars. You basically put wooden doors up or paper doors up, cardboard doors up in the car, and then you would load the car. And there'd be a point where the angle of repose dictated how much grain you could put in a car. It wasn't a really efficient way to handle a bulk commodity, but that's what you had. You would load 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 cars per location. It could take you 2-3 days to load those cars, and that's how product was moved in the prairies. The investment was limited. I think it was the industry generally was in a state of capital inertia in terms of the fact that there wasn't a whole lot of investment either in primary handling, transportation, or processing in the agricultural industry in either Eastern and Western Canada. Traditional crops, traditional marketing methodologies that had existed since the First and Second World War. Canadian Wheat Board, quotas, permit books, access to markets. Who were we selling to in those days? We were selling to primarily Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Primarily cereals. The new crop on the scene was canola at that time, relatively new, and still in its infancy in terms of its potential. There was some processing that had been built in that late 70s, 60s, 70s period to process it, but it was for primarily a domestic market, a food-based market domestically. The players dominated by co-ops, prairie co-ops, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan wheat pools, United Grain Growers, local family-owned businesses, Richardson, P&H, Patterson. One new player had arisen in the mid-70s. That was Cargill. Cargill came in and bought a traditional prairie grain handler called National Grain, which had actually been owned out of Minneapolis. So it was foreign owned, but it was participating in Canada. So where are we now? Well, we went from in that late 70s period, a period of I think radical evolution of the business, particularly as we got into the 90s, and understanding we had to invest, we had to renew, we had to reinvent how we moved bulk commodities in the world. We also needed to ask ourselves, is this economic model viable? Is it sustainable? Can you grow 30 to 40 million tons, do it on the kind of production per acre, with the kind of equipment, with the kind of inputs that you've got, and be viable as a farmer at the farm gate or anywhere up through the system? So it was a very fragile environment in terms of that. Then what happened? Well, I think the biggest thing that happened was a transportation revolution, a handling revolution in the early 90s. And we started to build facilities that were more in league with the needs of efficiency. Keep in mind, we have inherent disadvantages. We produce the product thousands, in some cases, well close to 2,000 kilometers from where it is exported, if you're going to go to an export position. you're going to deal with very challenging geographic and climatic conditions. So what you really have to be good at is logistics and supply chain. You got to be as good or better than the others, right? So you couldn't sit back and say, well, this is good enough. This efficiency isn't really efficiency that's evolved or changed over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades. Well, that's good enough. Of course, it wasn't good enough. So it was inevitable that something had to change. And the early denominators of change, the railways, were pushing the idea we can't have 3,500, 4,000 collection points. We need a more efficient system. We need fewer lines. We need faster loading. We need greater concentration of activity at certain points within that infrastructure. And that's what happened. We started building elevators, and people started increasing from 8 to 10 to 25 to 50 to ultimately 100 to 112 cars that you could load at a particular facility. They called them inland terminals. They were really just large, more efficient grain elevators. That's what they are. Probably today, I don't know what the number is, but it's probably 150, 160 collection points for grain in Western Canada versus 3,500, 4,000. So that's a big, big change in one person's career reference points, right? But here's the other things that become interesting. Now we've got a much more diversified menu of products that we grow. We grow the cereals, we grow wheat, we grow durum wheat, we grow barley, we've got flax, but now we're also growing peas and lentils and chickpeas and a variety of other things that diversifies the markets that you can access. The market has changed completely on the global basis. Now you're going to Asia, you're going to the US, you're going to Latin America, you're going to North Africa, you're going to the Middle East, and you're not going to Eastern Europe, you're competing with Eastern Europe. The biggest exporters and producers of wheat now are Russia, Ukraine, the EU, and then Canada. And we used to be primarily supplying Russia and the Eastern Bloc of Europe. They're our biggest competitor. So what denominates our success or failure? A commitment to globalism. Globalism, I don't mean in terms of walking in lockstep, but recognizing what the indices for success or failure are on a competitive basis in a global environment, because our environment is a global environment. Now you talk about another thing, who do we sell to in those jurisdictions that I'm talking about? Are these first world nations in large part? No, they're not. They're second and third world nations. So everything has to do with price. The 5 questions that we would get asked in terms of what are the denominators for success in a transaction on Canadian agricultural products on a global basis is price, reliability of execution, and integrity in terms of quality expectation. Right? You got to have a process that's believable and has integrity and believability in terms of what I bought is what I got. And I got it when I needed it, as you said I would. But then I still want it at a price that's competitive. And that's almost inevitable, and it's a standard feature. So much more global, much more distribution of products in a larger net of opportunities, but also much more focus on efficiency, and efficiency locked in with price.
You know, speaking of the elevators and efficiency, I can remember seeing a number, it was like 5,000 tons a year was a turnover on a small elevator. That means an average of 100 tons a week. How could you afford an elevator operator and the elevator and all the costs, including taxes, to move 100 tons a week of grain? Again, it's kind of mind-boggling what was done back at that time in terms of its efficiency. What about today? Are there logistical impediments in the Canadian system that we still need to work out? Or is it as boring as I suggested it might be?
Absolutely we do. And where they are areas, I think the collection system is as good as anywhere in the world. I think the collection system in terms of efficiencies, just to put it in a case in point, if I'm loading cars at any prairie location for a destination, could be Vancouver, could be Prince Rupert, could be the head of the lakes at Thunder Bay, could be beyond any of those locations to a final destination. The basic relationship I have with my carrier, the railway, is that I have to load those cars within 24 hours of constructive placement of those cars. It doesn't matter whether it's 20 above or 30 below. It doesn't matter whether it's the middle of a snowstorm. It doesn't matter whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Those cars have to be loaded if I want to attract an incentive that the railway gives me for efficiency. And there's nothing like providing incentives to people to get a response. And that response could be a combination of operational response and or capital response to try and figure out how you can access that opportunity. So I think the collection system's okay, Barry. I think the rail system, that's been a long time bugaboo for me and us. We talk about the two things I say to my colleagues at the railways. You talk about planned logistics and what's precision railroading. I said that's an oxymoron because quite often we don't know what an ETA on arrival of cars is. We don't know what the ETA is on the arrival of those cars at the export position. And keep in mind, you're running this thing through the narrow end of the funnel. I'll take an elevator in Vancouver, and I'll ship from 60 different locations in Western Canada to meet a vessel on berth at that facility to take 60 to 70,000 tons of product, and I'm doing it in 10 to 14,000 ton increments in producer cars, excuse me, not producer cars, but unit trains, and I'm doing it through a facility that has a grand total of 180,000 tons of capacity. So you're turning over. I'll handle 5.5 million tons of grain a year, grains, oilseeds, pulses a year, varieties, probably 30 to 40 different grades and varieties of product through a facility that's 180,000 tons. And I'm doing it from origination points by rail that are 1,800 kilometers in the interior at a number of different locations. So that's a real logistical challenge. I think we do a pretty good job of it. Where I'm concerned is those obstructions and those impediments that are, I think, particularly found at that narrow end of the funnel, particularly at the port position. I'll give you a case in point, just to graphically describe it. Vancouver, biggest port for all commodities moving out of Canada to an export position. And it's a very crowded, multi-purpose port, right? You're doing grains and oilseeds and lumber and manufactured products and coal and sulfur and you name it, pellets and wood fiber and a variety of different things. And so you've got all this crowding of activity. One thing that I would say is very concerning to me is the Second Narrows Bridge. The Second Narrows Bridge, which feeds all the facilities on the North Shore of Burrard, is a rail bridge, it's a lift bridge. Every time a vessel transits underneath that bridge, the bridge has got to go up, which means you can't get any rail traffic to the North Shore. Should anything happen, you recall the issue with the bridge in Baltimore, where it took out the bridge in Baltimore because a vessel got off track and hit the pylons to support the bridge? Well, that same thing could easily happen in the Second Narrows in Vancouver, and then that entire North Shore capacity, which is tens of thousands of tons of capacity, millions on a yearly basis, would be out of reach, right? That needs to be addressed. I think you want to build resiliency and redundancy into that kind of critical, very pointed area of infrastructure. By the way, just a added little comment to it. What's happened over the course of the last year? We've got 800,000 barrels of oil, crude oil, being picked up. You have to transit with oil tankers under that bridge to go and get that extra 800,000 barrels a day coming in on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, right? Nothing wrong with that if you've got resiliency anticipated and built into your system. Second thing I'd say, what does it do in Vancouver a big chunk of the year? This is a really easy one. This is low-hanging fruit, right, in terms of an obstacle. What happens in Vancouver, at least 200 days a year, it rains. What are we shipping in terms of we're shipping agricultural product as human food product. So you can't adulterate that product. So the hold opens, you're pouring the grain into the hold, it starts to rain. What do you got to do? You got to close the hold and you got to wait till it stops raining. Or you can come up with a solution. The solution is a very simple one. You tarp it. But then the labor unions say, no, that's dangerous. We don't want you. We want to make it so difficult for you to do that it's not going to be worth your while financially to do it. And you say, that doesn't make any sense. If so much of our energy and product and volume is moving through that port, we got to find a solution. I've been in the business for as I say, 48 years. I haven't seen them come to a solution on that particularly simplistic to me problem. But hope springs eternal. So just two little things on infrastructure that I think make a big difference.
Very interesting and scary at the same time. Looking back, over this 30 years, I'm trying to think, looking forward 30 years, and who could dare to predict where we might be 30 years from now, given how much change we've seen already. But there was a lot of pent-up change, obviously, that had to come. We're now seeing loop tracks, for example, and other things. The question I do ask, though, is this trade issues. We heard this morning that non-tariff barriers are certainly not going away. In fact, if anything, they're more of a problem than our tariff barriers. Is that also the case in the grain industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Cam's not here any longer, is he? Cam Tall? He had to leave. Cam made a very good point. What we're seeing today is not new. It's just got a different definition. It's got a different descriptor attached to it. It's wide open, obvious tariffs. What we've been dealing with for over decades are more subtle, less definable things called non-tariff barriers, right? And every one of the jurisdictions I'm talking about has applied non-tariff barriers against Canadian agricultural products at one point in time or another. CETA had, the ink hadn't even dried on the Canada-EU trade agreement, and they were coming up, the Europeans were coming up with issues related to Canadian durum. I had a ship present in Bari on the Adriatic at an Italian port. It was boarded by the farm workers union or the farmers union, and they sampled the vessel and they said, you know what's wrong with this vessel? Unheard of before. It's got too high a glyphosate level residue in the durum. It was not a trade issue. It was not an indice that had ever been dealt with before. But it served the purpose of preventing Canadian durum from going into the Italian durum market when the Italian farmers had a lot of durum that they needed to sell. The Japanese, or excuse me, the Chinese, you think this is the first time the Chinese have pulled this in terms of a geopolitical interface with trade? This is a standard operating procedure. Blackleg. Does anybody remember blackleg? Blackleg's a fungal disease in canola, and they said, you got too much blackleg in your canola that's being shipped. Why? Because they were producing too much rapeseed in the interior of China, and we were too competitive on a price basis and in terms of favorability basis with the crushers in China. So they wanted Canadian canola, they didn't want Chinese canola. So what did they do? They came up with this, once again, a quality standard that had never been heard of before or discussed or agreed to, right? 2018, March 1st, we were deregistered as an exporter to China. Why? Well, because Madam Meng was being held by the Canadian government on an extradition treaty with the U.S. Department of Justice in Vancouver, right? So they had to leverage. It was economic. We were for 3 years an economic hostage. So why us? Well, because we're Canadian, and we're the biggest exporter to China, right? Our company. So is this new? Vietnam, Peru, Colombia, North Africa, it's a constant thing of, I'd rather have an open, clearly defined tariff than one that I'm battling in terms of a quality consideration of which there is no resolution. And those can last for years, right?
That must add a lot of risk to the grain handling industry if you're shipping something.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even this most recent gambit with the Chinese, it's clearly, as was mentioned earlier, you mentioned it, it had everything to do with Canada putting a tariff on EVs, on Chinese EVs. So what do? They figure out what sector could we take a run at, and why would we take canola? Well, it's because we have substitutability. We can find products to serve our requirements that are not far off in terms of acceptability, either quality or price-wise. So then why did they at the last minute? They started an investigation on canola seed dumping. That was the reference point. We were dumping canola seed at low prices into China. It's totally illogical that we would do that, right? And so they said that's what the investigation's all about last September. And then, of course, suddenly, overnight, it was oil and meal. Like, no one had ever talked about oil and meal, but I think the Chinese, my observation would be, 2 weeks prior to that announcement, they put a tariff on U.S. soybeans. Well, you got a domestic crushing industry in China, right? You got to support the domestic crushing industry if you're the government. So what do? You say, geez, well, we can't do it on canola because we need the canola seed. Let's do it on oil and meal. We'll hit their oil and meal industry, 100% tariffs, right? Then time went by. They were able to adjust, and now they've come up with 78 point something % tariffs on seed. And that they did it to the Australians a few years ago on barley and malt barley. Why? Because the Australians said, I think we need a further investigation as to how the COVID virus came from Wuhan. The Australians were out of the market for 3-4 years. And so it goes. It's what you could expect from that trading partner, and that therefore, in terms of risk, you have to be able to pivot. The company that I did represent up till earlier this year had a big book of business. You have to put a book of business on when you're dealing in this marketplace on a forward basis. So what do you have to do when you get these sudden body blows? You get blindsided like this. You have to pivot, and you do. And those that can't pivot successfully and have no other alternatives and can't function in that kind of uncertainty don't survive.
I'd also like to allow anybody in the audience that has a question, please to go forward. Derek, I see you are there. And I think there's another microphone at the back, I hope. Yes.
Kurt, you talked about how the industry changed over your career, and I was wondering, especially that initial shift and then the beginning in 2001 when we started to monitor things, were there some regulatory things that made your incentives to invest? Were there some improvements in regulatory?
Yeah, the question was basically, there was changes took place. Some of those changes were quite revolutionary, not evolutionary in terms of the 90s, and what happened as a result. Well, one of the things that happened was you saw a change in terms of the players that survived that revolutionary change, right? So I said the co-ops, prairie co-ops, the three prairie co-ops probably represented, when I joined the industry and right up through into the 90s, 65% of the total handle in Western Canada. You had UGG or over 75%. So farmer participated, farmer-owned, farmer-denominated organizations. But then this revolution in transportation, which was kind of forced on the industry, and when I say forced on the industry, it was the reality of what we had to do as an industry. It required unprecedented investment. Well, when you're making unprecedented investment, it goes back to your point in terms of trucking, you better have a growing market. We didn't have a growing market at that time, right? We weren't changing our marketing structure, and so the volumes didn't compensate for the investment. So the people less well positioned to survive that didn't survive that. There are no prairie pools today. There is no United Grain Growers today. There is a different group of players, some of which survived and some of which have come into the market since that point in time. So here's an interesting thing, and I'll just put it up there. It's an argument, we could have, or a debate we could have I said when I joined the industry in the late 70s, the production in Western Canada was 30 to 40 million tons, grains and oilseeds and pulses. Bad crop, 20 million tons. Good crop, 45 million tons. We had never produced a crop in Western Canada over 55 million tons up to 2012. What happened in 2012 and what happened in 2013? In 2012, the wheat board lost its monopoly. Okay. What happened in 2013? In 2013, Western Canada produced the biggest crop it ever produced, not by a little bit, but by a lot. It produced 75 million tons. never produce a 60 million ton crop. We've rarely missed producing that. 2021, we had a drought and it was 45 million tons or something like that during the drought year 2021. But every other year was either high 60s or 70s. This year, the estimate for production in Western Canada, grains, oilseeds, and pulses, 80 to 85 million tons. Think about that in terms of, Bank of Canada is talking about a crisis in productivity. This is a victory in terms of productivity. Investment, billions of dollars invested in domestic processing, particularly in crushing and refining. I think there's going to be some more in terms of milling before the smoke all clears, which would be welcome as well. Durum milling in particular. So this is a win for Canada. It's a win for agriculture. But what's it based on? It's based on the ability of people to act in a normal, rational, economic fashion. Not to have it distorted, not to have it modified by policy or regulation. Open it up. Sure, keep regulation in where regulation is effective to keep a level playing field. I don't argue with that. To keep the integrity of the system intact, but let people rise and fall basis their capacity and their willingness to change, invest, react, move on.
There used to be an old statement in Canada or Western Canada that wheat was something like 13% protein and 87% politics. Today, we hear that food processing is the largest single manufacturing industry in Canada. But of course, farm numbers have greatly reduced and the vote for farming has reduced. Do we still have the right political representation, I guess, for the food and agriculture industry that we should have?
Well, yeah, I think it's, I think that this whole issue with tariffs it's kind of graphic in a manner of speaking. Agriculture takes the hit for issues that are specifically related to manufacturing in Eastern Canada. It would be my general observation. EVs, automobiles, steel, aluminum, right? All of those were basically tariffed on China, and what gets hit? Canadian agriculture, particularly Western Canadian agriculture, right? We protect supply management, but what's the answer for this kind of collateral damage to the Canadian agricultural industry that it had no part in creating? There was no tariffs on Chinese agricultural products that would have attracted that kind of response, right? It's trying to say, and that's the reality, frankly, of dealing with a customer like China. You have to accept the fact that it's all going to get tangled up as well. Trade is going to get tangled up in geopolitics, and that's as simple as that. So buyer beware, so type of thing. And if you think, does that mean you don't do business with China? When we were banned from moving canola into China in 2018, completely unfairly, having great relationships over the course of decades with the Chinese, and we were the collateral damage at that time. Did we stop selling anything else to China? Absolutely not. Sell them wheat, sell them barley. And the Australians were in the penalty box because of their comments on Wuhan and the virus. So we sold them lots of barley. Happy to. You just have to accept the inevitability of that kind of a relationship and that kind of an attitude.
Well, speaking of the importance of food, I see, very quickly.
I just did, because this kind of tracking this forward, and what we're talking about is this, and there's a really important point that's made, is I think Mr. Trump has been the whack on the side of the head, like totally out of the blue. It's woken us up. But I think the point has been made across here that this protectionism has been growing for a long time, and I think we've all been kind of and kind of, well, it'll go away. No, it's not. And one of the key points was U.S. in terms of fuel, and what Brittany was saying. I made a comment I don't think I put in there. The Inflation Reduction Act is just brutally protectionist in the United States. Now, they did something smart, having a production tax credit, which we as a country should do, but it's total. It is all protectionism. And it's how do we deal with these things? And I think alluded to, and this is part of my little bailiwick, is value adding. And one of the things I asked Aaron, you guys are the dominant guys that move, the trucking guys, because very specific and very targeted, they move the pea protein from roquette. It's not railways. It's very targeted, specific trucking because it's very higher value. What we need to do is create higher value internally, whether that be SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuel. That's the other one aside from renewable diesel. All the other middle distillates of that. The value of the meal, including potentially extracting human grade stuff out of that, if we can get that moving more, that means higher value. That means we can, move out and do other things. Selling stuff maybe to the Europeans if they would be interested, or for example, the Canadian military buying up all the sustainable aviation fuel from Canola because it counts as defense spending. So how can we be more rational? You're talking about we need to be rational. How can we be more rational in general directions, addressing these matters of trades, tariffs, and the biggie in the room has always been protection.
Critical, yeah. Right off the bat, critical thinking, right? Think objectively. Put yourself in the other guy's position, and then act dispassionately, but intelligently and strategically and tactically, right? Like everybody's all riled up about the U.S. tariffs. The U.S. Put yourself in their position. This administration, $1 trillion trade deficit, and you're elected not by the Canadian people, not by the Chinese people, not by the EU. You're elected by the American people to figure out a solution. So they're figuring out a solution. What is it, in my opinion, appearing to be? It looks like you're going to pay for access to the U.S. marketplace. That's what you're going to do. You're going to pay access. Can you pay access? Of course. You're going to just have to, I don't want to, belittle this, but we live in this environment. This is where we made our living over the course of a half a century in my particular case. But I look at it and say, the rest of the world doesn't care about Canada. They care about themselves. It doesn't matter whether it's Algeria or the U.S. or Colombia or wherever it happens to be. And we get all excited. Well, I was at the Ag Day in Ottawa back a few months ago, and they were, Team Canada. We're going to Team Canada. I said, they don't care. Nobody cares about Team Canada. You might feel better about it, but the thing is, where are they coming across, and how do you adjust? How do you adjust? So a 10% tariff? If they put a 10% tariff on canola oil, I guess I'm going to have to adapt, right? And I still want access to that market. 100% tariffs, I think you mentioned it, 100% tariffs there is no trade, right? Who's putting the 100% tariffs on? It's China. That's not the U.S. So if we can come up with a logical understanding of what they want, what they need out of this, what we need out of this, and find that reasonable middle ground, away we go. You're making the point about renewable diesel. Big market opportunity. You know what? If you take a look at the clean fuel legislation in Canada, the amount of renewable diesel we're going to need relative to plant production capacity in Canada, in spite of Imperial at Fort Saskatchewan and the one out in the West Coast, and we're going to have to import from the U.S. We're going to have to import renewable diesel from the U.S. to meet our own standards, right? So I look at it. We've invested in, and I'm not trying to, give ourselves a pat on the back. We've got the biggest canola crushing plant, arguably, in the world at Yorkton, Saskatchewan. 7,200 tons a day, 2.5 million tons a year, 250 B trains a day, 3,000 tons of oil a day, 4,200 tons of meal. And it's all going to have to find a market. And is it running at capacity? It's running at capacity. So you find new markets, and you find new markets opportunities, and you price yourself into those market opportunities. That's what you do. So what do I find interesting about this whole renewable diesel thing? What they've done is they're and not illogically, we do the same things. They're basically tilting the field of play in favor of soybean oil. How are they doing that? Carbon emission indices, right? So what's your carbon emission? Well, they put canola at over 50%, soybeans under 50%. Where do you attract the tariff from the federal government for renewable diesel? Under 50%, right? So they're saying, we're not going to put our money into Canadian canola, grown in Canada, crushed in Canada, and shipped to the United States. We're going to put our subsidies into that. But what does that do? Well, I think that if you take a look at their numbers, and if they go to their numbers that are in that legislation, their soybean crop is going to have a hard time meeting that expectation, that requirement. But what does that do? It forces the food industry in the United States, which is the premium market, into other sources of supply, i.e. maybe canola oil. So you can't look at it as, oh, this is all bad. There's no way out of this. We're boxed in a corner. You find the path forward. You find the way around it. You work, and so what would I be doing? We're building refining capacity in the U.S., right? For canola oil, not for soybean oil, for canola oil. Because I think it's going to. Why do you need refining capacity? Because you need it for the food market. You don't need it for the renewable diesel market, right? You ship a crude super degummed to the renewable diesel market. Anyway, I don't want to take up any more time, but these are interesting dynamics, and you really have to understand the complexity of them. And quite often, a lot of the strategies, the policies, are well intended. The government policies are well intended, but ill-conceived and executed. And so when you got, we're going to put because of the renewable diesel, we're going to put a two-year subsidy on Canadian renewable diesel to encourage it. Do you think anybody builds a biodiesel plant for 2 years? These are 30-year investments. So nobody's going to do anything differently, but they'll say thank you. Does it do anything for us long term? No, it doesn't. Figure out the things that make sense and understand that if you're going to be in a global arena, you better understand the global arena and play by the same rules. You can't play by your own rules.
Kurt, thank you so much for your very interesting and profound statements. At this point, we have to say goodbye to our folks online. Thank you very much for joining us. The importance of food is not lost on any of us, and especially since I can see the lunch at the back, and it's time for us to have lunch. So everyone, thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you again, Kurt. It was a real pleasure to have you.
Great meeting.
Very interesting and profound statements.